Great news, everybody! To the best of my knowledge, this video isn't considered an act of treason. Mind you, I live in the US, so that could change at any moment, but we're gonna run with it anyway. In fact, since we're already on the subject, let's just keep talking about crimes. It is Pride Month after all. Since I'm sure we're all nerds here, I can probably safely assume everyone has voyeuristic tendencies, right? Not in an accusatory sense, it's just nerds have always loved being places and seeing things we aren't supposed to. It's why so many of us own lockpicks. And while fear of legal and personal conflict prevents most of us from breaking into any actual buildings, the desire is usually there, and many nerds indulge it through the much easier and safer option of breaking into people's computers. Which still sounds illegal, but here's the secret. They'll just give them to you. See, I'm not talking about big corporate computer systems. We're not hacking the Gibson here. I'm talking about people's PCs. A lot of folks don't understand that those store data, so it's not rare to be given a computer, or to find one on the side of the road, with a perfectly intact hard drive full of everything from emails to tax records. It's been happening to me my whole life. And it's not just clueless grandmas doing it either. Businesses are just as guilty. You'd be shocked how many companies will just dump computers at their local e-waste recycler without even bothering to ask about their data security policy. In fact, I'd say it's easier to get a hold of an unwiped business PC. Now, I mean, most resellers do wipe drives as a matter of course, but some aren't as careful as they should be, and there's always things that slip through the cracks. So you can find an awful lot of computers on eBay with intact data, particularly when they look appliance-y. Take point-of-sale systems, for instance. Modern cash registers are often perfectly ordinary PCs that get used for all kinds of things besides ringing people up, but many recyclers treat them like dumb gadgets and just flip them online the moment they come in, frequently without even bothering to wipe the dust off. So if the idea of poking around in a Burger King manager's PC excites you, congratulations. That's something you can often do for less than $100. Have fun. Although, if you actually try this, there's a good chance you won't have any fun. I don't mind telling you that when I first started collecting used computers over 20 years ago, I was excited by the prospect of digging through people's secrets. It's a scummy thing to admit, but I mean, come on, this was the era of ThinkGeek selling "I read your email" shirts, and I was just as cringe as the next computer toucher. Once I actually tried it though, I found out that it's usually pretty boring. I can almost count on my fingers the number of times I found genuinely interesting stuff, and even that's only because I've owned a tremendous number of PCs. I'm Computers George, a statistical outlier who shouldn't be counted. And even then, the most exciting thing I've ever found, if I'm honest, was News You Can Use, a collection of internal newsletters from the local P&W fast food chain Taco Time, which I pulled off a discarded cash register years ago. And I admit, it was a blast reading about their tater-tot supply chain woes, but that's just because of me being the way that I am. If you're not like that, well, May 2012, product development, composting. At this point, all corporate restaurants have made the switch to composting in the dining rooms. We have already received a lot of positive feedback from guests. There have been very few issues with regard to sorting compost from garbage. Cedar Grove has reported that while they have found some milk bottles and ketchup packets so far, the first few weeks of compost have been remarkably clean. To make the sorting even easier for guests, Gretchen is currently working on signage for the small garbage that includes photographs of the garbage items. The new signage will be sent out as soon as it's ready. There's been some worry out there that the small garbage is insufficient for busier restaurants, which has led some owners to choose to have it lit. You get the idea. It's pretty dry stuff. Devices used in business usually just contain business stuff. Employee files, accounts receivable records, and printable sign templates, none of which is the least bit exciting unless you're an identity thief. And actual personal computers are even worse. Having actually read people's email, I found that it ranges from dull to depressing. You might not be surprised by this, but it's actually really sad to read someone's divorce proceedings. It leaves you feeling really guilty. I only had to do that once to learn my lesson, so probably don't go through people's stuff. It's really not much fun. But fun is usually the only concern here. There's not generally much risk to this pastime. If you want to read some juicy goss from someone's old Word documents or comb through HR letters about a really bad coworker, maybe that's a little crass, but I'm not going to judge you. And neither will anyone else, because they're not going to know. When you're done having your little schadenfreude, you can just throw the drive away and wash your hands of it. And sometimes that's a huge relief when a computer turns out to be radioactive. I don't mean literally. Well, I guess it could be literal if you got a hold of a machine that was running a particle accelerator at a university or whatever, but that's not what I'm talking about. I mean that once in a while, you'll pick up a PC from eBay or a thrift store or whatever, and when you fire it up, you realize you really shouldn't have it because it used to belong to a psychiatrist, a lawyer, or a hospital. This feels like seeing the words drop and run. It's a real bad spot to be in because you now have a bunch of proper secrets, stuff that could get you sued or hurt someone if it got out, and that's if it doesn't land you in jail. Now, we don't need to go into what's on that list, but the number one item would have to be government and military secrets. It may sound silly to imagine finding that sort of thing by accident, but hey, the US is full of military bases and flash drives are easily pocketed and easily lost. So I can totally imagine finding one in a gutter that contains classified info that doesn't look very classified. You know, like the lunch menu for an upcoming presidential visit, or the specs for the bolts on an air-to-air missile, that kind of crap. And if you found something like that, it'd be really easy to reflexively share it with your friends, or maybe even upload it to Internet Archive. It just feels like an intriguing little artifact. And I mean, you didn't steal it, so what's the problem? Well, really, there probably isn't one. Based on what little I've been told by people who know about these things, you probably wouldn't get a visit by the Secret Service, especially if you didn't go to great lengths to spread it around. But the math is different for someone in my position. My stuff gets seen by hundreds of thousands of people, and at this point I've learned that if I make a video about something, it will make its way back to a person who worked on that thing. So I have to think real hard about every object I find to be absolutely certain I should be talking about it, and sometimes the answer is no. Once or twice, I've declined donations when I wasn't convinced the thing I was being offered was really fit for public consumption. So you'd think if someone offered me a PC that used to belong to the military, I'd refuse it, but there's exceptions to everything. This computer once belonged to the US Department of Defense, as you can see from the asset tag on the front, and it was almost certainly used to process secret military information. While almost everything on this tag produces no useful results in any database I've searched, there's one term right in the middle that says a lot: ASTW. That stands for Agency Standard Terminal Workstation, and the agency in question was the NSA. Based on that and some other info I found, I think this machine was almost certainly used for cryptography work. So there was a time when just knowing about it would have gotten me in trouble, possessing it would have landed me in prison, and talking about it on my channel, which includes viewers from countries we're technically at war with, would have gotten me hung, at least if YouTube had existed at the time. So I had some trepidation about covering this thing, but I'm pretty sure I'm in the clear. For one thing, you can't exactly fit this boat anchor in a pants pocket, so I doubt someone walked off base with it. I'm sure the only reason it's here is because it was sold at public auction. I also have strong evidence that it was never actually secret itself, it was just used to process secrets. And there's no real risk of it still containing any of those, partly because all military hardware has to go through an extensive data clearing procedure before it can be disposed of, but also because this machine has no storage other than a floppy drive, which came to me empty. It also didn't come from any kind of unusual source. I found this at the local e-waste store where someone just walked in and threw it away, something you wouldn't tend to do with stolen military secrets, so I'm pretty sure this is safe to have. So what then do we have? Well, it's an IBM model 4459, also known as the EMR-AT, and if you're familiar with IBM's 1980s lineup, you can probably guess that name suggests a relationship to the PC AT. And you'd be right, as I think obvious, if we put one on top of the other. The family resemblance is pretty clear, right? Now, we don't need to get too deep into what the AT itself was, but it's a bit less well known than the machines that came before and after it, so let's just summarize real quick. As I'm sure we all know, IBM released the original PC, the Model 5150, in 1981, and it was a smash hit that sold hand over fist. But it was also their first attempt at a home computer, so it wasn't perfect. And a couple years later, they released the PC XT, Model 5160, which was welcomed with open arms, despite being nearly identical. In total, 3 years went by without a significant addition to the PC lineup, until finally, in 1984, they released the PC AT, Model 5170, the first meaningful upgrade in the PC family. And it was a pretty big upgrade. While the PC and XT had the same 4.7 MHz 8088 CPU, the new machine used an Intel 286, which had a more efficient internal architecture and was clocked faster, initially at 6 MHz and later at 8. Its expansion bus was also 16-bit instead of 8 like in the PC, so the card slots were longer and could transfer more data. It had better built-in support for hard drives, a built-in real-time clock, it supported more RAM, and even had a new keyboard design. So it brought quite a few substantial upgrades compared to the XT, but it didn't exactly replace it in the market. Don't get me wrong, people definitely bought plenty of ATs. It was a successful product, but it was also a high-end product that most people didn't need. If you were doing CAD, desktop publishing, or software development, it had clear advantages, but for most contemporary tasks, it didn't really offer any major pluses, which is why by 1987, IBM had sold almost 7 million PCs and XTs, but less than 1 million ATs. In a lot of ways, the AT deserves more credit as the forerunner of all modern PCs than the original PC does, and yet they're shockingly rare these days, to the point where I almost couldn't get one for this video. I looked everywhere and came up empty-handed until at the last minute, one of the generous members of the Seattle Retro Computing Society offered to loan me this one. So here it is, and we're not going to turn it on, because nobody likes seeing the same thing twice, and that's what we'd get if I demoed both of these machines. The EMR-AT, after all, is functionally identical to a standard PC AT, so we're just going to set that up and demo it. Not that there's all that much to show. Like any PC, you set it on a desk, put a keyboard in front, and plop a monitor on top. If you're using it for business applications, that monitor is probably MDA, a monochrome text-only display with a pleasant green phosphor. But this system actually came with a CGA card, so you'd have a lower resolution color display instead. When you turn the machine on, you see a very terse post-process. It does a thorough and very slow memory test, but tells you nothing else unless there's an error, such as the CMOS config being corrupt due to a dead battery. On that note, by the way, the AT was the first computer to have a CMOS config. The PC and XT just had dip switches and jumpers for their settings, but since the AT's integrated real-time clock offered a few bytes of non-volatile RAM, IBM used that to store some system configuration. Since that memory used CMOS technology, the terminology stuck, and we still call it that today, but unlike a newer PC, when you replace the battery, you can't just press delete on startup to restore your settings. The setup utility is a program you have to run from a disk, which was very inconvenient, but actually common in PCs up into the early 90s. After the post, if you have no valid boot sources, the machine pops straight into IBM BASIC, which is burned into the system's ROM chips. And unfortunately, that's pretty much useless because it can only save or load data from cassettes, and the cassette interface was removed back on the XT. Fortunately, however, nobody ever wanted to do this since ATs were always kitted out with a floppy drive and usually a hard drive as well. So most likely you'd drop into DOS, then fire up something productive like Lotus 123 or AutoCAD. And these will run exactly the way they did on a PC, just a little faster, so we don't need to dwell on them. However, speaking of fast, let's start up Bruce Lee. This was an early PC game and a pretty decent one, but you can probably tell that it's running much too quickly. This is a well-known problem with early PC games. They used timing loops calibrated for a 4.7 MHz CPU, so they run too fast if your clock speed is higher than that. PC clones famously offered turbo switches to correct for this problem, but IBM never put a speed control on any of their own machines, so this is unfixable on the AT, except by using software tricks to slow the machine down. IBM probably never cared about that, however, since the machine wasn't intended for gaming, and for productivity, the faster CPU was just a flat-out improvement. To wit, if we swap out the CGA display for a VGA one, and a matching graphics card to go with, we can now fire up Windows 3.0, and despite that being 6 years newer than the rest of the machine, it runs perfectly. Word for Windows can reformat a whole page in a second or two, and trust me, that's a tough nut for an XT to crack, so assuming you could afford one, the PC AT was clearly a really nice upgrade. And to repeat myself, that is exactly what we have here. As you'll see when we get inside, these two machines are identical in every way that counts, but before we can do that, we have to talk about the outsides because those aren't identical in a lot of other ways that count. Let's just start with the front. You see the key switch over there? That disables the keyboard so unauthorized users can't use it, and it also locks the case so it can't be opened. Now, the EMR-AT also has a key switch, but as you can see from the imposing new label, it has other functions. This one doesn't lock the case, but it does control the power. See, normally you turn an AT on and off with a big clunky red paddle switch near the back of the case. But that's absent on this machine. Instead, turning the key switch turns the machine on and off. And then if you want to disable the keyboard, you can turn it further to the third position to do that. This is a minor difference to be sure, but it's an odd one. And the drive bays are also a little strange. They look just like the ATs at first glance, but the cutout here is taller. You can fit 3 floppy drives instead of just 2. And that seems unremarkable from a modern perspective. We've all seen cases with 12 drive bays, so who cares, right? Well, the thing is, there really wasn't much you'd want to put in a third bay at this point in time, which is why IBM didn't offer one on the normal AT, so why'd they do it here? Well, we'll get to both of those later, but they're minor mysteries. They can wait. First, we need to turn these machines around because things get a lot weirder on the back. You'll notice as we rotate them, by the way, that the EMR-AT is about 4 inches deeper than the normal one. You'll see why that is shortly. But first, we gotta see this back panel because it's a trip. Though, before we compare them, we should really pull this thing off. Nobody I've spoken to is quite sure where these plastic panels came from, since most ATs don't have them, and they serve no purpose I'm aware of except to make the back of the machine gray. They're basically the PlayStation 2 horizontal stand of the IBM world, so we'll get rid of that. So this is what the back of an AT usually looked like, and well, you'd never mistake it for an EMR-AT, would you? Not only do the two machines look totally different, but this one doesn't even look like a PC. If you saw these stacked up in a storage unit, you'd think one had been misfiled because the EMR-AT looks like some kind of proprietary industrial control box. Instead of the AT's shiny black paint job, we have this much heftier looking beige powder coat. The supply inlet and outlet are in totally different places. There's an external fuse holder and there's no cutouts for add-on cards, just a bunch of D-sub connectors surrounded by this weird metal grid. It looks like it's from Mars, but as you saw a minute ago, it definitely acts like a normal PC. So we're gonna wanna look inside and see how that's possible. And right away we run into some more differences. The original AT case was held in by 5 very long screws around the perimeter here. Now, of course, nobody likes taking those things out all the time, so like everybody else, I just have one in. Let's run that out. And then we just slide the single piece cover off the machine. We just slide it right off and it doesn't catch on anything. There we go. We just slide that off and reveal the tender innards. Simple as. Now, let's see how the EMR-AT does it. So instead of the U-shaped lid that the original machine has, this has a simple flat lid that's held on by 9 hex socket bolts. So start getting those out. And you'll notice as I remove these that they're actually captive and spring loaded, so you can't lose them. This is a very unusual decision for any computer really, but especially one from the 80s. I definitely appreciate it though, because I would not want to replace these if I lost one. With those out, we can now remove the lid, which turns out to be a shockingly hefty piece of die-cast aluminum. And setting that aside though, we can now see the guts of these two machines, although the customizable nature of the PC kind of makes an apples to apples comparison difficult. So let's just get these out of here. With the two machines stripped down to the bare essentials, you can now tell that in electronic terms, they're totally identical. Take the motherboards, for instance. Both of these are 3rd revision 5170 boards, and if I pulled them both out and put them on the table, you wouldn't be able to tell me which one came from which. The power supply is also the exact same unit, almost down to the sticker placement, and the cards are extremely ordinary. Let me just get those. Here's everything that was in the machine. So, we have a standard Western Digital floppy hard drive controller. This is a 3-COM Ethernet card, not the most common thing for 1987, but also not unheard of. This is a pretty common type of memory expansion card that also has, I think that's like a game port up there or something like that. Then we have 2 serial parallel cards, pretty bog standard stuff there, and then an IBM CGA card. All right, so I don't know how this happened, but I misidentified this thing. It's clearly an IBM MDA card, which makes a lot more sense for this application. And when this was pointed out to me, my reaction was, oh, I must have swapped the cards by accident, because I distinctly recall that when I looked inside the case for the first time, this card said color graphics along the top edge. I even remember thinking, wow, that's strange. And then I added comments to the script about how strange it was. And yeah, it would be strange because it never happened.
We made this one up. It's a made-up tale.
I have photos from when I first opened this thing, and it definitely had this card inside. I really can't explain how this happened. I know what the 2 cards look like. They're impossible to mix up, so I just flubbed it. And now, fortunately, this doesn't really affect the narrative, but there may be a couple odd cuts here and there as I edit around this mistake, so I needed to point it out. Sorry, let's try to carry on. The point is, there's no exotic circuitry on display here. And since the cards are all ordinary, that means they bolt into the card cage just like any other machine. So this is all straightforward, but here's where things take a sharp turn, because there's about 4 inches of space between these cards and the rear panel. So they're just sort of floating in the middle, entombed, as if they insulted Montresor. To light up all these plugs that we see on the back, all the connectors on the cards have to go through these little 6 to 10 inch jumper cables. So that's pretty weird, right? And it doesn't stop there. Since the power supply is an ordinary AT unit, it still has that big chunky paddle switch. It's just hidden over here on the side where you can't get to it. They flipped the switch on at the factory, then sealed it up so you can never turn it off again. That's why they had to move the power control to the front panel. And on that point, I mentioned the key switch on the front controls the power, but if we pull that out, we find 2 little micro switches on the back. This pair of plastic cams operates them, pressing one, the other, or both as you rotate the key, but those switches can't handle the full voltage and current from the wall. So instead, the line cord plugs into this little hermetically sealed box, which I assume contains a relay that's controlled by the micro switch, though I can't prove that because the box is soldered shut for some reason. Also, the switch is connected to that box with a hunk of plain old silver telephone cord, so someone was trying to save a few bucks, but I digress. These are clearly some odd decisions, but you can still see what I mean, right? The machine is basically just a standard PCAT, but it's been built into a much heavier chassis. It's got that massive cover I showed you. There's 2 layers of metal between the cards and the rear panel, and even the removable storage bay has been sealed up with much more solid walls on all sides. And I'm sure many of you have already sussed out why they did all these things. I mean, hell, the explanation is right in the model name. And for the people who figured that out, this could have been a 20-minute video. But based on the responses I got when I was planning this thing, I'm gonna guess a lot of viewers have no idea what's going on. And that would make sense because this machine was built to solve a problem that none of us are supposed to need to care about. In fact, it's one that's really hard to even understand, so let's level with each other about this. To be frank, I lucked into this machine. I stumbled on it. I almost didn't recognize what it was. And even when I did, I kind of groaned because I really didn't want to make a video about it. I wasn't intending to take it home. But I then found out that nobody has ever really documented one of these things, so I knew I kind of had to do it. But the trouble is, covering this topic requires understanding a bunch of concepts that I only sort of grasp. Don't get me wrong, there are many elements of this explanation that I am confident about, but there's others I'm pretty shaky on, and I don't want to mislead you. So, while I think it'll be obvious from my tone and delivery which parts are which, I just want to make a blanket statement up front that this video is primarily for entertainment purposes. I am not an expert on any of this, and you should walk away at the end thinking, wow, that's an awful lot of things I want to go learn more about, rather than, wow, I sure do understand all those things now. The only job I'm really any good at is pointing at the insides of a computer and telling you what I think they do, and I have to try to give you an idea why they're being done that way, so I'm gonna give that a shot, but take all of this with a handful of salt, and check the comments for the inevitable corrections. With the disclaimers out of the way though, let's start by discussing something that surrounds us every single day, but which almost none of us ever notices. EMR. All electrical devices, as a byproduct of their function, produce electromagnetic radiation. That is, ripples of electrical and magnetic energy that travel through the air. And since these oscillate, that is, their energy level pulses as they travel, they're also known as EM waves. Now, when we generate these on purpose, they're called radio waves, and we use them to transmit everything from AM talk shows to Wi-Fi, but all electrical currents produce some kind of EMR, and it's probably obvious that this is something we have to think about as a deeply technological society. We have billions of electronic devices, and if all of them are emitting waves, then surely those travel somewhere and do something when they arrive. So what do they do? Well, fortunately, the answer is often not much. If we look at a 1970s washing machine or a tungsten filament light bulb, for instance, both give off EMR, but at very low frequency. The waves only oscillate 50 to 60 times a second, which means, for complicated physics reasons, that anything they run into isn't likely to absorb much energy from them. So very little happens as a result. All the same though, these fields do exist, and you can visualize them with simple tools. Like the one I lost. Where the hell did I put it?
It's right there.
There it is, like this one. This is an inductive amplifier, and it's a very simple device. It's just a coil of wire connected to an amplifier and a speaker, and when you hold it within an oscillating magnetic field, whatever it picks up is converted, or transduced, into sound. And this came as part of a tone and trace kit, so people often call it a tracer. And the other component is this guy here, the toner. Now it's called that because if we switch this on and then hold this near the leads and press the button, we hear this oscillating tone. And the purpose of this thing is for network diagnostics. Suppose you're troubleshooting a bad network jack in an office building. You'll have a cable disappearing into a wall, and then somewhere else, a closet where hundreds of cables terminate at a patch bay. And these ought to be labeled, but they probably aren't, and even if they are, the labels are probably wrong, so you don't really know which cable has the bad connection, and your only real solution is to go through and check every single one and probably just repunch all of them. Hours of work. But if you attach the leads on the toner to the exposed wiring at the jack end, you can then go to the patch panel end and just wave the tracer over the wires until you hear that noise, and then you know you found the right one. In fact, in some cases, you might even be able to figure out which closet a cable's going to by tracing the sound through the wall. So this is clearly an incredibly useful tool, but it's also a very simple one. It doesn't much care how you use it. It'll amplify anything it picks up. So if we hold it near something that runs off of wall current, like this Apple TV, we can hear the 60 hertz hum typical of the American power grid. And if we hold it near this little gadget here, is one of those little display turntables you sometimes see people use for like model car YouTube. The motor is, I think, right about here. There we go, let's turn that up a bit. So that's the sound of the motor driver. And if we put a load on it, we can actually hear it slow down as the motor slows down. Likewise, if we get a much more complex device, I've got this Bluetooth gamepad here, and listen to what this does when we turn it on. Yeah, your guess is as good as mine, what we're listening to there. I'd guess the that noise right there is probably the control circuitry that's adjusting the brightness on this LED here, because that could probably get brighter or dimmer, so it's that's pulse width modulation you're hearing. But as for all the other stuff, I got no idea at all. But my favorite example, if we hold it near this smartphone, we hear all sorts of stuff, and it changes when I do stuff, but I have no idea why. I don't know if I'm listening to the display driver circuitry itself, or maybe to the scanning circuitry in the touchscreen, or if some of that's coming from the radio or the CPU, or who knows what. It's hard to say because there's so much going on in there. But the important thing is those sounds are coming out of the phone, and they change when I interact with it. This is a very important point, so remember it. We'll be coming back to it later. The important thing is, this proves our devices are all emitting something, but so far that something doesn't seem too nefarious, partly because it's so short range. We can only pick up these sounds within a few inches, so it seems like a pretty limited phenomenon, but there's a lot more going on than just what we can hear. For one thing, these devices are all producing pretty complex EM fields, but this instrument only picks up the M, not so much the E, so we're only measuring part of that field. And we can only hear things in the audio frequency range, that is, fields oscillating up to about 20,000 hertz. Anything above that, your ears can't detect, and there's a lot above that, most of which we refer to as radio waves. There are many definitions of what constitutes a radio frequency or RF signal, but usually it refers to frequencies above a few hundred kilohertz and below a few hundred gigahertz. These are signals that work well for long-distance transmissions, that can be made with conveniently sized and affordable equipment, and which offer enough bandwidth, we won't get into that, to encode useful information like audio or computer data. These constitute most of the signals that are flying through the air, and since all of them are well above the range our ears can detect, the inductive amplifier won't let us hear any of it, but it is out there. Boy, howdy, is it out there. As you're watching this video, your body is being saturated with radio signals of all types. Some are pretty strong, like the ones from radio stations and cell towers, which are measured in watts or even megawatts, while others are incredibly weak, like the Bluetooth connection between your phone and your AirPods, which only uses a few milliwatts. At these energy levels and frequencies, they really don't have any effect on you personally, but they can affect your devices. I mean, the whole point of radio signals is for them to affect devices, so duh, right? But what I mean is that every radio signal affects every device, whether it wants to or not. In the simplest terms, you produce a radio signal by sending oscillating electric current through something conductive. Metal is good, but anything will do. We call this conductive thing an antenna, and it produces radiating waves which travel in all directions, or if you shape it very carefully, mostly in one direction, depending on what you need. Now, to receive that signal, you then stick another antenna in its path, and as the wave passes through it, some portion of the energy will be captured and converted back into electrical current. If you then send that current through an amplifier, you can reproduce the original waveform that was fed into the transmitting antenna. Now, there's a lot of nuance to this, because the exact shape and size of an antenna greatly affects how well it captures a given signal. Longer ones are better at receiving signals with lower frequencies, meaning they capture more of the energy and produce less distortion, and vice versa. This is why the antenna in your car, which picks up signals in the kilohertz and megahertz, is around 3 feet long usually, while the one in your phone, which operates at several gigahertz, is at most a couple inches long. But this is just a matter of degrees. Every conductor will absorb a portion of any signal that passes through it, even if it isn't meant to be an antenna at all. And many of us have seen, or at least heard, firsthand proof of this. What's about to happen might not have an effect on the younger portion of my audience, but it made everyone born within about 10 years of me reach for their phone. Sorry to punk you like that, but for anyone who doesn't know what I'm talking about, up through the 2000s, when you got a call on your cell phone, the signal would often get picked up by your computer speakers, resulting in this distinctly irritating noise that you sometimes hear in recordings from the era. And nowadays, it's not commonly heard anymore since they changed the format of cellular signals, but the point is that your speakers were never intended to receive this in the first place. So how did this happen? Well, these were the days when PC speakers were often hooked up with simple analog input cables rather than the digital interfaces often used today. So the audio coming from your computer was a very low-level analog signal, maybe a few hundred millivolts, which can't drive a loudspeaker directly. So your speaker set had amplifying circuitry that boosted that signal by a factor of, let's say, 10 to 100 times. Meanwhile, the signal from your cell phone was passing through that audio cable, where it gets picked up by the copper wires and turned into voltage. The amplifier can't tell that voltage didn't come from your PC, so the two signals get combined and amplified together, resulting in this audible buzzing sound. Obviously, this isn't ideal, but it's going on inside everything at all times. All those radio signals that are going through you are also going through, say, your smartphone. And not just its radio antenna, but its memory and CPU, where they induce little tiny current spikes inside every copper trace and silicon pathway. And this is known as electromagnetic or radio frequency interference, EMI-RFI for short. And obviously this can cause problems. Modern electronics deal with such tiny amounts of current that a stray radio signal penetrating a RAM chip could flip a bit from 0 to 1, which might crash your device or corrupt your data. And that's certainly inconvenient, but it's also potentially dangerous. Suppose your company builds industrial robots that weld car chassis. The servos in those things can move 2,000 pounds of steel in an instant, but they're controlled by low voltage logic signals coming out of microscopic chips. So if you aren't careful, someone keying up a walkie-talkie next to one of these things could make it swing around and decapitate them. You can't prevent people from using radios, however, and I mean, there's 1,000 radio signals flying around 24/7. So how do we prevent this kind of disaster? Well, in most countries, there are rules around this, and here in the US, the big one is Title 47, Part 15 of the Code of Federal Regulations, just Part 15 for short. It requires that devices accept any interference received, and there are a lot of ways to interpret that, but it basically means that you have to think about this stuff when you're designing a device and make sure that if it receives a signal it doesn't expect, it doesn't malfunction catastrophically. And there are a lot of techniques for hardening circuitry against RFI, but we won't get into them, mostly because I don't know any of that stuff, but also because the best way to deal with the problem is to simply prevent your device from receiving any interference in the first place. And we usually do that with shielding. See, when an EM signal passes through a conductor, part of it gets converted from photons to electrons. This is, again, how antennas work. But afterwards, there's fewer photons flying through the air because you trapped some of them in the metal. Well, the more metal you have, the more photons get trapped. And at some point, they're all trapped and you have no more signal. In other words, you can block radio transmissions by just putting a big enough hunk of metal in their path. Now, it helps if that metal is attached to the earth or grounded, since that gives the energy somewhere to go, but it's not necessary. Ungrounded metal still disrupts the hell out of radio signals, so if you want to prevent a device from receiving them, all you have to do is surround it with loads of metal. A comically exaggerated but still valid example of this was Atari's first home computer, the 1979 Atari 400. It was built inside a gargantuan die-cast hunk of aluminum. And this is because the FCC had just introduced the Part 15 requirements and nobody was exactly sure how stringent they were. Atari were worried about failing certification, so they brute forced the problem by putting the machine inside a metal sarcophagus. But this had nothing to do with keeping signals out of the device. You'll recall earlier I said that all electrical currents produce EM emissions, and this is true regardless of whether they're supposed to. As we proved earlier, there are signals radiating off all our electronics, even if they aren't meant to be radio transmitters, and radio is the right word because these are all well within the radio frequency band. As you're watching this, the CPU in your PC, phone, tablet, or smart TV is turning billions of transistors on and off to decode the video and copy it to the screen, and every time that happens, a little spike of energy radiates out into the world. And since your device's CPU is operating somewhere between 1 and 6 gigahertz, all those signals are within what we call the microwave portion of the spectrum, the same place where you find Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, and cell signals. So when we discuss EMI, we aren't just talking about those things, we're also including all the unintended radio waves that are boiling off our various devices. And the FCC regulations actually have a term for this. All devices that put out EM waves without meaning to are called unintentional radiators. Now, these aren't incredibly problematic on their own because they're usually very, very low power. Since the signals aren't being emitted by high-power transmitter circuits or through ideal antennas, the amount of power that escapes your CPU is on the order of microwatts, nanowatts. It's really small. As a result, it's not likely to induce any meaningful voltage in another device, although if you add up enough of them, it could. And that can cause problems. It also causes problems for actual radio receivers, particularly the ones that we use on a daily basis. Most consumer devices, after all, lack the necessary permits to use high-power radio transmitters, so things like Wi-Fi and Bluetooth are forced to operate in the ISM bands, a set of frequencies that are treated as a no man's land where anyone can transmit anything they like as long as it doesn't exceed a few hundred milliwatts. Naturally, this includes the very well-known 2.4 and 5 gigahertz bands, which in any urban area are choked to death with competing signals. So in order for your phone to connect to your AirPods, it has to distinguish their radio signal from thousands of others, and that's already a really tough job, but it'd be even harder if it had to contend with meaningless digital hash pouring out of thousands of thermostats, TVs, and robotic vacuum cleaners. And that brings us to the other half of the Part 15 rules, the requirement prevent the devices not emit harmful interference. Now, this too is interpreted in many different ways, but it basically means that if your device is producing too much EMI, the FCC won't let you sell it. And the simplest method to prevent this is to give your gadget a shielded chassis. Simply surround all your electronics in a metal box and nothing will get out. Problem solved. So entombing the Atari 400 was a valid solution, but it was actually massive overkill even back then, and once the FCC rules were finalized, computer manufacturers switched to much less aggressive techniques. Take the IBM PC, for instance. Its chassis was made of 1/16 inch steel, and even that might have been more structural than anything, since it also had to support the weight of a CRT monitor. Indeed, in later years, shielding in computers became far thinner. These days, if you crack open like a modern PC laptop, you'll often find shielding that's just 1/32 of an inch, or 0.8 millimeters thick, and in some cases, there isn't any solid metal at all. Oftentimes, the inside of the plastic case will be coated in a thin layer of copper that's been sputtered onto the plastic to form a very thin conductive layer, and that's apparently considered adequate. That should give you an idea just how weak these signals are. They could be absorbed by microns worth of shielding. But it should also illustrate how pervasive this problem is. While it looks like EMI isn't a big deal, it's only because there are wards against it built into every single thing we own to keep it from being a big deal. I mean, hell, even our cabling needs protection. Since data cables fundamentally consist of very long pieces of metal, they make terrific antennas, and since a modern USB-C cable, for instance, carries signals up into the many gigahertz, a 10-foot specimen can produce a hell of a lot of EMI if nothing is done about it. Fortunately, however, shielding doesn't have to be rigid. If you cut open a USB-C cable, you'll usually find metal foil, braided wire, or both wrapped around the conductors. And these shields, sometimes referred to as screens, are attached to ground at both ends of the cable, which keeps the signals contained inside the wires. The effort to keep airwave pollution under control is thus constant and unending, and even then, that's all just mitigation, not prevention. These countermeasures ensure that our devices are quiet enough that they don't usually cause problems, but it's just too expensive and inconvenient to do a perfect job. So they're all still emitting something. And a pretty common habit when discussing this is to refer to those emissions as noise. Now that term formally refers to things like the background radiation of the universe, truly random junk being emitted by stars and whatnot, which radio engineers have been used to filtering out since time immemorial. And, well, since none of the unintended emissions of our devices are meant to be radio signals, that is, they aren't intended to be received by anything, we think of them as random fluctuations, but the truth is, they aren't random at all. The noise emitted from your computer is, again, the result of transistors turning on and off. Every time that happens, it makes a little tiny ripple in the EM field, but since those ripples are a direct result of changes in your machine's state, your CPU is essentially transmitting everything it does straight into the ether. This sounds terrifying in privacy terms, but there's a lot of reasons that it isn't a big deal. For one thing, we're talking about hundreds of billions of high-frequency signals that are all very quiet, all intermingled, and pretty badly distorted after being converted from digital to analog. So the result is gibberish. It might as well be background radiation because there's no chance of anyone receiving and deciphering it. But a lot of EMI is much simpler than that. Take the data going down the USB cable from your keyboard, for instance. That consists of a single digital signal at a frequency as low as 1.5 megahertz and an amplitude of 3.3 volts. Since that's more than twice the voltage you'd find inside a CPU, and the keyboard cable is much longer than your CPU's traces, and often isn't even shielded, it's emitting a much cleaner signal. So, what if someone went out of their way to receive that signal? Knowing what we now know, doesn't it seem like a person with a highly directional antenna could point it at your PC through a window and just read your keystrokes straight out of the air? Well, yes. The answer is just yes. It's been proven multiple times over several decades that keyboard activity can be picked up and deciphered from a distance. Do I know all the details? No. Should we be worried about it? Probably not. Objectively speaking, this is a very real problem that could be exploited if someone wanted to spy on you. So if you're in that position, you should be looking to protect yourself by, say, buying peripherals with shielded cables. But you aren't being targeted, so you shouldn't bother. The US government is, however, so they do worry about this, and they have for quite some time. Basically forever. The earliest evidence that you could eavesdrop on electronic devices in this fashion dates back to the 1940s, but it was only known to the military at that time. It would be another 40 years before the public learned about it, and that happened in 1985 when a Dutch researcher named Wim van Eck realized that since the dominant display technology of the time, the CRT, generated massive EM fields to steer its electron beam around the screen, those signals could probably be picked up remotely to spy on someone's computer, and he went on to prove this, quite publicly. Working with the BBC show Tomorrow's World, he drove around London pointing a directional antenna at various office windows, and, well, the only version of that footage I can find is really low quality, so it's not clear exactly how effective this technique was, but he claims to have been able to read a letter off of someone's screen as it was being typed. And according to his published paper, this was not a prepared demonstration. In fact, he says he can't share the details of what they received for obvious reasons, by which he means they were literally invading people's privacy to run this experiment. Of course, intruding on strangers is the best way to prove a theory like this, but it's also the most concerning because it means the computers he was spying on were totally unmodified from the factory. They were all just broadcasting their users' activities into the ether for anyone savvy enough to retrieve. But, well, that was over 40 years ago, so things have improved. Right? Well, probably some, but the problem still ain't solved, and here's all the proof you need. That is an ordinary, unmodified consumer LCD monitor. This is an antenna that's picking up the signal radiating off the HDMI cable. The signal is then being digitized by a USB software-defined radio and decoded by an application to produce something sorta kinda like the original picture. And, okay, we can all agree this is not as disturbing as it could be for a bunch of reasons. For instance, I'm picking this up from just inches away, and if I move the antenna any further, the image gets very ghosty and then disappears completely. And in fact, if I get closer, it gets a lot better very rapidly. So range is definitely an issue. Also, well, it's not the sharpest picture, is it? And in fact, if we scroll down here, small text is basically illegible, and even if we zoom way, way in, I don't think you'll be able to read any of that. Also, it's black and white instead of color, so it's not exactly a perfect copy of what's on the screen, but it's still pretty damning. I mean, for one thing, if we're looking at an image with large details, you can make them out perfectly. So even if you can't read 14-point text, well, someone doesn't necessarily need detail that fine to get information you don't want them to have. So this still sucks. More importantly, though, I'm what InfoSec people might call an unfunded attacker. In other words, I'm doing this with total garbage. My USB radio is a Hack RF1 you can get off Amazon for $200. The antenna was, in fact, $15 on Amazon, and is neither directional nor tuned for the right frequency. And the software is a Java app that I downloaded from GitHub that was written like over a decade ago. So this demo is nothing special, and indeed, I'm about the millionth person to do this. YouTube has plenty more videos where this came from. I also have no idea what I'm doing. It took me a week of tinkering to even get a picture this clear, and in fact, it looked a lot better than this before I came into the studio to demo it. When I was testing this at home, I was getting a much more stable image without all of this jittering and distortion. I have no idea what this is about. My guess is that it's interference either from the nearby radio station or maybe all my studio lighting or something else in the building. I have no idea. I don't have the faintest idea what I'm doing. All I did was fire up this piece of software, put in some settings that I found in somebody else's video, and then just start plugging antennas into it and turning the dials until I got a picture. In other words, none of this represents what a funded, motivated attacker with a governmental R&D budget could achieve. So my guess is that if I can do this with garbage and no knowledge, then the state of the art is way better. Probably every intelligence agency on the planet has a little box they can just press a button on and it spits out a full color 1080p picture from whatever you pointed at. Now, they're not going to use that against you because you don't matter, but governments have much bigger reasons to worry about this kind of threat. And in fact, the name the US government chose for this worry is right in the title of the software I've been using. It's called Tempest. And boy howdy, is it ever a meme. Don't get me wrong, being a meme doesn't make it any less real or valid. I just call it that because I've been listening to people talk about this since I was like 14, and every time it's the same handful of anecdotes, so it kind of gets repetitive. Hey, did you know this? Hey, did you know that? Yes, I did 20 years ago. There's never any new information, but the reason for that is that pretty much everything relating to this topic is a military secret. Hell, even the name was for a while. Tempest, after all, was a code name, or as they were apparently called, cover name, coined by the NSA somewhere between the 40s and 60s to describe a lot of things. Basically the entire concept of eavesdropping on unintended radio emissions, which is a wide and varied field. The one scenario that I've sort of outlined so far is the crudest. You can imagine a foreign state actor rents an apartment with a view to the Pentagon, points a dish antenna at someone's window, and picks up the signal from their keyboard. Obviously, that's a big risk that has to be mitigated, but at least it's easy to understand just from what we've discussed so far. The trouble is, there's much more to it than that. For instance, it's possible for cabling that passes through a room to pick up a signal from a computer in that room, carry it somewhere else, and retransmit it without ever actually touching the computer in the first place. So if you have a secure machine sitting in a literal bank vault, the wiring supplying the electrical outlets in the vault could exfiltrate your data. And then there's the whole galaxy of what are called side channel attacks, where someone can't get their eyes on the actual data, but they can analyze something related to it. For instance, there's a whole field of study into power analysis, where an attacker can reconstruct data being processed by a computer just from a precise measurement of how much power it's consuming. That means even if your power wiring isn't picking up any EMI, if someone's able to tap into it, they might still be able to extract your crypto keys. I'm not going to keep listing examples, but just from those few, you can tell this is a big mess of a situation, and those are just the problems we know about. I've described some attacks that the entire InfoSec world has been familiar with for decades. There are, without a doubt, methods that have been discovered but kept totally secret, because the Tempest threat has been constantly evolving ever since it was discovered. To wit, I found this lecture given by an NSA expert in 1973 called A History of US Communications Security, and you should really read this thing. I'll put a link in the description. It's incredible. The report describes an enormous number of what 2010ers would have called epic fails. Things like crypto keybooks accidentally being given to high schoolers, one-time pads getting sucked up into ventilation systems, and incinerators with holes in them that let unburned sensitive materials just drop straight through into the normal trash. The whole document is pretty embarrassing, and yet it asserts that the stickiest problem the NSA faced was Tempest, both because the problem wouldn't sit still, but also because educating people about it just didn't seem to work. The author says that Tempest produced some of the most dramatic threat demos they'd ever seen, like a computer monitor image being perfectly reproduced from hundreds of yards away. Yet, after the initial jarring impact, everyone seemed to forget the problem existed. He doesn't speculate on why this kept happening, but I guess it just comes down to people feeling overwhelmed. Faced with a problem that's so vast and impactful, yet totally invisible, what do? There isn't really a knee-jerk response. With code books and crypto machines, you can make new procedures that tell people to keep them locked up and to burn and destroy them to prevent capture. But what do you do about invisible signals flying all over the place? You can't exactly scrape them up. You can't go get them back, but obviously you have to go do something, and they did, as we'll discuss. But since this is a very unintuitive set of problems, it's tough to mitigate, and at some point, the best solution might be to try to keep newly discovered threats under wraps in the hopes that the other guy hasn't discovered them yet. So, to this day, most info on Tempest remains classified, and that's why I'm not going to try to explain very much of it. Whatever the state of the art is, they aren't going to tell us, and anything we can find publicly will represent a fraction of the true threat, so there's not much point going into specifics. Fortunately, however, since EM radiation follows the laws of physics, the methods used to mitigate these concerns are all fairly generic, so it's pretty easy to talk about Tempest defenses without needing to know what the actual threats are, especially when we have one of those defenses. As you've certainly figured out by now, the machine I have here is a PC that's been hardened. That is, it's been modified to mitigate the threat of Tempest attacks as much as possible. So let's finally get back to the supposed topic of this video and see how they did that. First off, let's talk about the name. While the machine is labeled EMR-AT on the front, it was actually part of a larger product line that was known by several other names. And the one you'll probably see most often is TPC, which is obviously short for Tempest PC. And on that note, you will see these get mentioned in public from time to time. Sometimes you'll see them show up on eBay, sometimes they just pop up in random scrap heaps like where I found mine, and occasionally people talk about them on like the Vintage Computer Federation forums and whatnot, because again, these machines were never actually classified. IBM listed them in a number of public documents, including the 1989 Personal Computer Family Service Information Manual and the 1987 PC Product Reference, and judging from those documents, there seem to have been 5 models in the series. The TPC 1 and 2 were the hardened variants of the PC and XT, and while they aren't referred to here by this name, elsewhere I've seen these called the EMR-PC and EMR-XT. Meanwhile, my machine, the EMR-AT, was sold as the TPC-4. Then there were 2 more machines, the 3 and 5, and those were based on a couple of weird PC variants called the PC3270 and AT3270. Those were terminal emulators meant for talking to IBM mainframes using their 3270 terminal protocol. And those were incredibly rare even before they got tempested, so if you ever find a TPC-5, buckle up because it's going to do gangbusters on eBay. Speaking of prices though, thanks to that PC product reference, we actually have them for all of this stuff circa April 1987. This machine, with a single floppy drive and including both monitor and keyboard, probably ran about $7,400. That's roughly 22 grand in today's money. And for comparison, a similarly equipped non-Tempest AT would run about $2,000 less. So you were definitely paying a premium for the hardening, although it seems like if you weren't with the government, that premium went up even further. The commercial price tag on these machines was about $2,000 higher. And I don't know why the jump is that massive, but the bigger question is, why is there a commercial price at all? Aren't these things solely intended for soldiers and spies? Well, maybe not, as it turns out. I don't have any brochures to point to here to explain this. In fact, the paper trail on this stuff is really limited, as you might expect. But I do have some news articles suggesting that manufacturers of other Tempest-modified PCs were hoping to sell their machines to ordinary businesses, presumably hoping they could whip the cocaine-addled minds of their executives into a paranoid frenzy with tales of high-tech industrial espionage. So maybe these prices are aimed at that audience, or possibly they're for government contractors who often have to handle sensitive data, but maybe didn't benefit from the federal discount. In any case, though, we can see that the Tempest XT was about $1,000 cheaper than this machine, even with a hard drive, while at the other end of the range, the Tempest 3270 PC was a cool $11,000, or about 32 grand in today's money. So they probably didn't sell a ton of those. And in fact, they would only sell that model to the government, and I have no idea why. They also list various modified peripherals that you could buy a la carte, and we'll discuss what those were all about later, but amusingly, they describe them here as having been tempested, an oddly practical neologism by IBM standards. Now, what seems kind of absent in this list is the PS2, which was notionally IBM's hottest product in 1987, but that was bound to happen because the PS2 had literally just come out the same month that this was published. However, it seems like they never got around to making a Tempest variant of it. Even by 1989, there's no mention of a Tempest PS2 in the PC Family Service Manual, and around that time, third parties were apparently buying PS2s off the shelf and modifying them to be Tempest hardened. So it seems that IBM just never updated this product line. And for that matter, while I can't find many references to this stuff at all, the earliest ones I can find are from 1987. My particular unit has 1988 date stamps all over the place, and the latest reference is that PC Service Manual from '89, so it's possible that IBM only made Tempest PCs for a couple years. But I don't know that for sure, and at this point, you know pretty much everything I do about the history of this machine. Like, in terms of hard copy, like actual hard evidence, that's pretty much it. I can't find any press releases, any other documentation, or even any Usenet posts about them, except from one guy in 1993 who said an e-waste store was selling them by the pallet. Although I did find a little bit about these in CryptoLog, the NSA's internal newsletter. Cryptolog is an absolute hoot, by the way. There's 137 issues that have all been declassified, so you can read them on Internet Archive or on the NSA's own website. And the contents are just fantastic. The articles run the gamut, from in-depth commentary on failures of the NSA's procedures to simple lists of tips and tricks for crypto analysts. The graphic design is also completely off the wall. This stuff was made by a mix of like stuffy secretaries and nerds with free access to early desktop publishing systems. So sometimes there's little drawings that look like funny stuff your mom would stick to the refrigerator, but then you have articles that look like the Strip Club for Dummies book that Cornelius made in Achewood. It's hilarious, especially once you realize that these folks are talking about pretty serious stuff. This article, in fact, is about traffic analysis software. Traffic analysis is the practice of finding out what other governments are doing by looking at how many messages they're sending and to who, rather than their contents, which are usually encrypted. Anyway, this is talking about a piece of traffic analysis software called PinSetter, which I don't know much about, except that it was first developed on big iron machines running Unix, but eventually got ported to the PC, where it sometimes still ran on Unix, specifically the PCIX variant sold by IBM. Now, I had never in my life heard of anyone actually using PCIX. Actually, I didn't even know it existed until I read this. I went and looked it up at that point. It was like, there was another Unix besides Xenix. No one told me. Anyway, Cryptolog is full of articles talking about this thing, and apparently it was just miserable to use. For instance, out of the box, it apparently had a cron job that would just print the date and time to the screen once an hour, even if you were in a program. So it would just periodically trash your interface. This sounds pretty miserable, and there's actually a lot of other tips in there on how to make PCIX suck less, but it's also just one of many tips scattered throughout all the issues of Cryptolog in this era on how to make the ASTW itself work better for your day-to-day. So I get the impression these things were pretty widely deployed, although to be clear, while this just says ASTW on the front, it seems like that term originally referred to the PCXT back in 1984. And later on, they seem to have extended it to ASTW AT, obviously referring to this machine, but I can't tell if all of these are talking about the Tempested variants or if they were just talking about the plain old regular machines. In any case, however, the earliest mention I can find of ASTW AT is from 1987. So based on all of this, I am very tentatively proposing that the EMR lineup probably didn't appear until 87, that the AT wasn't adopted by the NSA until the same year, and, as I said earlier, that this machine was most likely used for cryptographic analysis. And given the lack of hard drive, but presence of an Ethernet card, I strongly suspect it was being used as a diskless workstation. Since it has 3 whole megs of RAM, a shocking amount for the era, it's possible that it was net booting PCIX off a server, or maybe booting DOS from a floppy and then running software from a network share. But that's pretty much all speculation. I am totally out of hard citations by this point, so all that's left is to take a closer look at the machine itself. As we discussed, the main approach to mitigating EMI problems is shielding, so it's no surprise that the TPC basically amounts to a heavily shielded PCAT. But as we also discussed, the PC was already shielded. The whole chassis was made of steel, and it surely passed the FCC's tests, so why wasn't that good enough? Well, simply put, it's because the FCC didn't really care about emissions below a certain level. A device could have detectable EMI, but as long as it didn't exceed their threshold, it could be sold. And IBM's chassis passed those tests, but the military needed a machine that produced basically no detectable emissions, and that wasn't the AT. If we take all the stuff out of a PCAT and just take a look at the chassis itself, you can see that the case is really just a pair of U-shaped steel plates, which fit together at a 90-degree offset. This design originated in the PC and was ubiquitous throughout the 80s, and really up through the 90s, since early tower cases had pretty much the same design, just rotated 90 degrees. And while this approach was kind of miserable to open and close, it was still pretty serviceable by the standards of the time, and very sturdy, which was important because you were going to put a monitor on top. The EMI performance, however, wasn't great. Radio engineers are prone to saying that RF is like water. If you leave a hole somewhere, it'll find it and escape. So the general rule of thumb is that a well-shielded chassis should be essentially watertight, and the AT case wasn't. Not only does the W design leave huge gaps between the panels at pretty much every corner and seam, there are also holes punched all over the place, including the card cage, the power supply vent, the opening for the power switch, and the drive bays. This may have met FCC specs, but from the Army's perspective, it leaked like a sieve. That is not true for the EMR version. Let's just get the lid off this thing, and I'll show you what I mean. I should say, get the lid off again. I think I've put the lid on and taken it off like 6 or 8 times so far shooting this video. I feel like I could have been more efficient. It's a complex topic, all right? Boy, is my hand getting tired. Finally. The majority of this chassis is still made of sheet metal, but it's been formed into a sort of bucket with all the corner joints welded shut and the only major opening being this one here on the top. But also, it's not made of steel. This entire case is aluminum, a fact I almost got wrong. You may have noticed that pretty much all the unpainted metal is this light yellow color. It's got kind of an iridescent sheen to it. I don't know if it comes through on the camera. Now, that generally indicates that a surface has been treated with zinc chromate. And in this era of computing, that was really common to see on steel. This machine doesn't seem any lighter than the AT, so I just assumed it was steel until I went to stick my iFixit screwdriver magnet to the side of the thing as a gag and nothing happened. I then tried everywhere else and found that no part of this machine is steel except the power supply. That sticks just fine. So that was a little embarrassing, but like, you can't blame me, right? Who would make a whole PC case out of aluminum? I really have no idea. It could be because the increased size of the machine compared to the AT would have made it unfashionably heavy, but I don't imagine IBM cared much about that. After all, despite the weight reduction, it still has a Team Lift sticker on the back, and armies tend to be full of big, strong men who can be ordered to carry heavy things, so I don't think that's it. Though I admit, it is convenient when working on this thing by yourself. You saw earlier how unpleasant it is to lug around, but most of that weight is just from the machine's components. The power supply, the cards, the motherboard, the hard drive if you have one. The chassis itself is so light it can actually be picked up with one hand or even a fingertip in a pinch. The lid is actually heavier than the case, so the weight reduction is substantial, but again, I don't think IBM really cared about that. My best theory is that this actually has to do with its electrical properties. Aluminum, after all, is more conductive than steel, which I believe improves its shielding performance, so that may be the reason, but I couldn't confirm this with cursory Googling, so I'm open to other suggestions. Moving on though, as we discussed earlier, they have altered the drive cages a little bit. Originally, both cages were just like this one, skeletonized to reduce the weight of the machine and improve cooling, but the external drive cage here is made entirely out of solid steel now. You can see it goes down the sides there and even goes down the back. And then the lid, that isn't perfectly solid. It's got these vents here, which we'll talk about shortly, but it is held down very firmly by 8 nuts, which holds it perfectly flat to the chassis. Likewise, the expansion slots on the back, which we saw were replaced with this wacky I/O panel, are also held perfectly flat to the chassis with 8 separate screws. Now we'll break down each one of these decisions later, but what you can see right away is that the inside of this case is essentially radio tight. If you're a stream of photons shooting off of one of these chips, no matter which direction you pick, you're gonna run into a big, thick metal wall, and you're gonna get partly absorbed by that, but whatever's left of you is gonna ricochet off and hit another big metal wall, and so on and so forth until you run out of energy completely. There's virtually no way to sneak out of this thing without getting absorbed, except for all the big gaping holes. For a bunch of reasons, this case can't be hermetically sealed. There are a number of holes in it that look like they'd compromise its integrity, but I can explain why they don't, or at least why most of them don't. One's a total mystery to me, but we'll start with the low-hanging fruit, the huge opening on top. Obviously, that would let everything out if not for the lid, but we do have a lid, and boy howdy, what a lid! It's really quite a nice part. It's made of die-cast and then machined aluminum, and well, chances are you weren't wondering why this was the only cast part in the whole machine, but you should have been, because it's an interesting question. I had to think about this for a bit, but I think I see why they did it this way. See, This lid could have been a simple flat sheet like the one on top of the drive cage, but there's a few problems with that. First, when you're attaching a piece of metal this big to another one, it's really hard to keep them flat to each other. Metal really likes to bow in between fasteners, especially when it gets hot, and that can create gaps through which RF energy can escape. And the only real way to fix this is to just use a crapload of fasteners, which is exactly what you see in serious radio equipment. An RF cavity filter, for instance, might have over 20 bolts holding the lid down just to make absolutely certain that it's flush. And in this example, that's a box small enough to fit in the palm of your hand. If it was the size of this thing, you'd be talking about hundreds of bolts. That's how careful you have to be with this stuff. So the ideal solution here might have been to use a normal sheet metal lid and just put 100 bolts in it, but that would have cost a lot more, especially if they wanted nice captive fasteners like these ones. Also, the bolt heads would have protruded because there'd be no place to countersink them. Now, they could have used thicker, less flexible 1/4 inch plate to solve both these problems, but that would have weighed like an extra 15 pounds, maybe more, and they could have machined out the bulk of that plate to reduce the weight while leaving it thick at the edges to leave room for the bolt heads, but that would require a bunch of costly machining, and it would still weigh quite a bit. So instead, they cast this aluminum part that's lighter weight while having all the same properties. It's thick around the rim, thinner in the middle, and it has these nice little stiffening ridges so it can still support a monitor. This satisfies all their needs while allowing them to spend their machining budget much more efficiently. Adding the countersinks for the bolts so the heads have somewhere to go, flattening the mating surface out here so that it fits better to the case, but also, and I think most importantly, adding this groove. See, thick as it is, this lid is still too thin to stay flat without warping, and the case itself isn't made out of materials precise enough to mate with the lid perfectly anyway. So instead, they added this ridge all around the opening on the case, which mates with this groove on the lid to form a kind of labyrinth seal, if you will. That's absolutely the wrong name, but it's how I think of this sort of thing. You have to consider that the fit between these parts isn't perfect, and it really can't be. The materials they're working with here just aren't that precise. So there's a fairly large gap between the two, but in order for RF to escape, it would have to shoot up towards the lid, bounce into the gap, then ricochet all the way around that ridge, which isn't very likely to begin with, and even if it happened, all the energy would get absorbed into the metal before it could make it outside. Now, I'm certain I've seen this kind of RF seal before, but I couldn't figure out a name to look it up with, so maybe I'm imagining things, but I'm pretty sure this is a common practice, and I'm gonna go ahead and say that the top of this case is essentially radio tight as a result. So that's one hole down. Next, let's look at the vents. One of the problems with sealing up a PC is that computers make a lot of heat, which all has to go somewhere. Now in low-end machines, you can kind of get away with ignoring that. The Commodore 64, for instance, just had a couple tiny vents on the top and bottom and cooled itself by convection, while modern industrial PCs are often fully hermetically sealed and cool entirely through passive heat sinks. But that's possible because both consume very little power. The C64 ran on about 25 watts, and modern PC hardware can run on 10 or less. But the AT, on the other hand, was pretty spicy, even by modern standards. In fact, all the PCs were. The original 5150 had a 63-watt power supply, which was pretty chunky for 1981, but the XT and AT bumped that up to a whopping 192 watts. That's outrageous by 80s standards. But these machines needed to run hard drives and high-performance add-on cards, which eat loads of power and spit out tons of heat. So right from the get-go, IBM PCs always had active cooling. They didn't have discrete case fans like modern computers, but they did depend on the power supply fan to draw air through the case so that the chips weren't just relying on convection. So the original AT's power supply fan was exposed directly through the back panel, which kept the machine cool, but was a huge problem for EMI. The power supply fan, after all, is made mostly of plastic, which is basically transparent to RF, so the fan cutout is essentially a big gaping hole in the shielding. The same is actually true for the power switch. It's also plastic, so exposing that through the side of the machine allowed signals to leak out of the PSU. So, in the EMR-AT, both of these things are buried inside the case. The key switch replaces the power switch, as you saw, and instead of the PSU attaching directly to the back panel, it's stood off by several inches, and this duct directs the hot air out through the vent grill on the back. And that seems like it just causes the same problem, right? I mean, we moved the goalposts, but only about 4 inches. We still have a bunch of holes in the case, so you'd think RF would just escape through those anyway. And the same's true on the other side. You can see we've got these intake vents on the faceplate here. Well, if we run out 2 screws on the bottom here, we can take that off. With those out, we just pull on the faceplate until it pops off. It is an absolutely horrible feeling, but there's a couple little spring catches here, and that's just what they sound like when they come off. It's very discomforting, but it doesn't seem to be causing any damage. Anyway, on the front, behind where those vents would have been, you can see there's perforations on the case. Now these obviously have to be here so that cool air can come in and flow over the motherboard on its way to the power supply, but again, it looks like EMI will just leak straight out. It doesn't, however, because of some peculiar behavior of radio signals that's weird and hard to understand, but which you've seen in action thousands of times. And I'm not going to attempt to explain why, because literally everything I've read on this subject is incomprehensible to me. But in short, radio waves don't like going through tiny holes. Every attempt I've seen to explain this in simple terms turns out to be an oversimplification or still too confusing, at least for me. But it seems that radio waves, for all intents and purposes, have a diameter. They won't fit through holes smaller than a certain size, and that size depends on the frequency of the signal. Higher frequency signals will fit through smaller holes than lower frequency ones. Why? I don't know, but the important thing is, as long as you pick the right size holes, perforations in a shield will still function as if they were solid metal. This is very reliable and effective, and the proof is that you're still breathing. See, you know how your microwave oven door has that screen behind the window that makes it a lot harder to see what's cooking? That's actually an RF shield. The microwave heats food using about 1,000 watts of radio energy at a frequency of about 2.4 gigahertz within the microwave portion of the spectrum, hence the name. And the glass in the door is pretty much transparent to that energy. The only thing keeping the oven from frying your face is that metal screen. Since its perforations are matched to the frequency of the radio waves, it reflects nearly 100% of them back into the oven. And I've always found this really weird to think about because I don't think the glass actually needs to be there at all. Like, please don't actually try this because I could be wrong, but I'm pretty sure that you could remove the window and it would still work. You'd just be staring directly at a kilowatt of invisible energy coming right at you, looking straight at it through the holes in the metal, seeing what the radio waves are doing to your food with nothing directly between you and them except air, and yet they wouldn't do anything to you. Like, a bubble of hot grease could pop and hit you through the mesh. That could hurt you, but the radio waves couldn't. This is a very strange thing to conceive of for me, and it's really hard to accept that it works, but it must, because otherwise we'd all have pretty bad sunburns. And if this works to contain thousands of watts of energy, then it's obviously going to work for far weaker signals, like the nanowatts leaking out of a computer. So, despite the fact that we can see into the case through these holes and see parts of the machine that would be emitting secret data during operation, those emissions couldn't escape. It's bizarre, but very convenient, since without this little trick, it'd be pretty much impossible to shield any high-power device without it suffocating in its own waste heat. So, that's ventilation resolved, but now let's take a look at the drive cage, because that confuses the heck out of me. It's yet another huge hole in the chassis, and it looks at first glance like it might be sealed up pretty well, but there's some problems here that I haven't yet figured out. So the drives naturally need power and data cables to function, and this cage has slots and holes to allow those through. See, the power cable goes through this grommet right back here, and then the data cable goes through this slot on the side. Now, those sure seem to me like they'd be leaky. I mean, if the tiniest gap in the lid would be a problem, and the perforations in the vents need to be no larger than, what is that, 1/8 of an inch, maybe like 3/16 of an inch, then surely this like 3/4 inch opening right here is big enough to drive a whole radio train through? Well, maybe. I don't know. I have no idea how the math works for this stuff. Maybe for the frequencies inside this machine, which would be no higher than 16 megahertz, a 3/4 inch hole is effective. I'm really not sure. But it's also kind of moot because, well, they're sending the cables themselves through, and that presents plenty of other problems. Let's just get the top off here so we can get a closer look. I'll just spin out all these nuts. Boy, that took forever. I'll take a pound of nuts. That's a lot of nuts! Now we'll take the cover off so we can see the drive, and now we want to get that drive out. And the way you do that on this machine is actually kind of unusual compared to the PC and XT. So around on the front of the drive, you've got 2 screws, here and here. We'll take these out, and those just remove these little L brackets. But now, the drive will actually slide out. Well, we got to get the cables first. Let's just pop those loose. We've got the data cable, the power cable, and then the ground strap, which I believe was actually present in the original AT and PC because they weren't not worried about EMI, just not this worried. Anyway, the drive will now slide out on a pair of rails, which looked really wild to me at first. I thought that was something they had done for who knows what reason, just for the EMR-AT, but it turns out these were a standard AT feature I'd just forgotten about. IBM actually spent the entirety of the 80s trying different approaches to mounting drives. The PC and XT both used different solutions, both of which were pretty irritating. So for the AT, they switched to this approach, which is much easier to work with, rather than having to get 2 screws out of both sides of any drive to get it out, which is really hard when you've got, this cage in the way of that cage. They just do this rail system, which, well, obviously makes it vastly easier. Just like that, you're done. These didn't really reappear in the PC world until sometime in the early 2000s, I want to say. And in the meantime, I had seen a lot of 286 clones, but I'd never seen a genuine 5170 until I got the 2 I showed you earlier for this video. It seems like most clone vendors didn't bother to copy the rail system, so I'd just forgotten that they ever did this. Anyway though, with the drive out, we can see that the data and power cables in here are perfectly ordinary. They don't go into like shielding envelopes or anything like that. So they're effectively outside the protective bubble of the PC case, and this would seem to present some problems. The first one is the risk of coupling. I mentioned this earlier offhand in regards to the hypothetical computer in a vault scenario. If you transmit RF towards one end of a wire, the signal will get partially absorbed, then re-radiated all along its length. This doesn't require any sort of active electronics. Any piece of metal will just do this. And to be clear, this is a really subtle phenomenon. The wire will only pick up a tiny portion of the energy, only some of that will be radiated again, and even that will be spread along the whole length of the wire. So what comes out at any given point will be very faint, but something will come out. That means that it's possible for the floppy and power cables to pick up signals radiating off the circuitry inside the case, carry them outside, and then re-radiate them, obviously leaving the chassis. Now, that could be concerning in itself, but before we can even worry about that, we need to think about what should be on these cables. After all, when you read a floppy disk, the bytes go over the data ribbon, and that seems like it would also radiate straight out of the machine, and it would be a lot worse because that's a full-strength signal, not just some re-radiated EMI from the inside. And to be honest, I'm not really sure what prevents that. See, my initial theory was that IBM was trusting the bulk of the floppy drive to act as implicit shielding, but I can't really see that being the case, at least not with this drive. I mean, it does have this very heavy cast base plate, which would block some signal, but the control circuitry is all on top, where it has line of sight right to the plastic bezel on the front. So it would seem like the signals from these various chips and transistors would just leak straight out the front. And I'd say that IBM felt the same way based on the differences between the two storage bays. As I mentioned long ago at the beginning of this video, the original AT had two drive cages, one for a hard drive and one for removable storage. Well, this one is the hard drive bay, and you can tell that if we remove the blank plate on the front. We're gonna take out another 4 screws here. These screws are all rusty, by the way. I don't know if you've noticed that, but both the heads and the threads have a decent coating of rust. And I really have no idea why. The rest of the machine doesn't look like it's been kept in humid conditions. There's no corrosion on the motherboard that I'm aware of. And I mean, the screws are also treated. They got some sort of coating on them. So I really don't know why these are the only rusty parts in the whole machine. I keep thinking about replacing them, but I haven't. All right, with that loose, we can take this plate off. And as you can see, it's got this sort of mat on the back. Now, this is very strange stuff. This is a kind of squishy, tacky elastomer of some kind, but it has conductive metal fibers embedded in it. So this is basically an electronic gasket. When you attach this to the case, it conforms to the front, so it seals up any gaps between the two, and that makes this plate, continuous with the chassis, so it forms an effective RF shield. And you might wonder why they didn't just do that with the lid too, right? If they've got this sort of gasket material, then why bother with the whole tongue and groove seal arrangement? And to that, I would say, I have no idea. Maybe I'm just wrong about how all that works. I don't really know anything, so there's no reason I'd be right. Anyway, though, IBM probably would have preferred not to have an opening here at all, since that would make it much easier to keep the thing sealed up. But, well, you need an opening to get a hard drive in or out. So they grudgingly added this plate, which you're supposed to keep in place at all times to keep it sealed. And we can tell that's the case because the inner cage is built just like the one in the AT. We've got the holes in the top, and the back is just completely open. So this provides no shielding, and that tells us that IBM saw it as part of the hot zone, the internal unsafe volume of the machine. So based on that, it seems like they wouldn't have bothered making the external bay this solid sealed metal box if they really felt that the floppy drives provided enough shielding, but I don't really know how else to explain this. I mean, it seems like it would just leak. And I don't know why it wouldn't. I have to believe that they did some kind of empirical testing and found that maybe the drive's bulk was adequate to block its own signals and whatever got coupled through the data cable, but it seems really hard to believe that they would have relied on that, especially once we look at what else was supposed to be installed in that cage. You'll recall another thing I mentioned earlier, that this is tall enough to fit 3 floppy drives, but that's not actually what it's for. And in fact, very few people would have even put 2 in here. The original PC shipped with 2 floppy drives, mostly because it didn't have a hard disk. So people were often copying data between floppies, and doing that with just one drive was slow and frustrating. But that didn't last. Hard drives started getting very commonplace in the early 80s and were, I think, pretty much universal on serious business machines by the time the AT came out. So very few people really needed 2 floppies anymore, and IBM didn't even offer that as a standard config on the AT as far as I can tell. It was an option, but all their promo shots just show a single drive and a blank panel, and that's what I see in most of the units on eBay. So if half of the AT's removable storage bays usually sat empty, then why add even more for the EMR version? Well, on a point of order, they only sort of did that. In reality, the external bay on the AT was also this big, but the third slot was hidden by the front panel. And that seems pointless, but it's only because that slot isn't for removable storage. See, when the AT first came out, hard drives were still what we called full height, meaning they took up, well, what we now think of as 2 5¼ inch bays. Back then, it was just considered 1 bay. but things changed. Anyway. So if the AT had only had 2 full-height bays, like the XT had, then you wouldn't have had room for 2 hard drives unless you removed your floppy drive, and those were still mandatory, so that wasn't really an option, hence the extra bay. That provided just enough room to install a second full-size hard disk under your single floppy drive, so it solved the problem for about a year until half-height hard drives came out and made it moot. But I digress. Since hard drives aren't meant to be seen from the outside, and IBM couldn't think of any other reason you'd have a third removable storage device, they didn't bother exposing that third bay through the faceplate. But for this machine, IBM had a very specific reason that you might want to do that. So let's talk about some of the miseries of secure computing. As I said, the EMR-AT was not in itself classified, but this specific unit probably was at some point because a computer becomes classified the moment it touches classified data. And this can happen to anything. If you work in the Pentagon and you're issued a crappy ThinkPad for your day-to-day work, you can probably take that machine home, let a coworker borrow it, etc., just like any normal business machine. But if you plug in a flash drive and realize there's a file marked secret on it, congratulations, your ThinkPad is now a secure system, and if anyone without clearance touches it, there'll be an investigation. So hopefully you had clearance. Now, once this happens, the taint can be removed, but it requires a data clearing procedure, a formal process written for the exact hardware in your machine that explains how to remove every trace of secure data. If you go through this process, the system will become unsecure again, which is how we're able to own equipment like this. Someone definitely followed the clearing procedure, which for this machine probably just consisted of remove the floppy disk, and that made it safe to auction. A fun little detail, however, is that the government wants documentation on this process for every electronic device they buy. That comes in the form of a statement of volatility, like this one issued by Dell for an LCD monitor. Now, that may seem like a ridiculous thing to worry about. We know monitors don't store any data from the video stream. It's all totally ephemeral. But they do contain memory devices, and it's up to the DoD or whoever to make their own judgment of those risks. So this document lays everything out. First, it sums things up by saying that the monitor contains both volatile and non-volatile memory, and that video is only ever stored in the volatile stuff, which is purged as soon as you turn it off. Dell thus assures the buyer in as many words that the monitor will not save, retain, or reproduce a signal after power is removed. But they then go on to list every component that can store data persistently and what data is stored so the buyer can make their own assessment. And of course, for other products like computers, the list is much more extensive. It includes things like hard drives and firmware flash chips and explanations of how to wipe them, or that they don't need to be wiped, or that they can't be wiped, in which case the machine has to be shredded when you get rid of it. You can look these things up for anything the government buys and learn a lot of interesting stuff about various devices, but I digress. The point is, if your computer ever becomes secure, the only way to undo that, generally speaking, is to wipe it, losing everything on your hard drive. So ideally, you don't ever want to cross these streams. Secrets should be handled on machines dedicated to that purpose and never used for anything else. But this isn't always practical. Suppose you're the boss of some satellite NSA office in podunk nowhere, right? You got 6 people crammed into a tiny rented space, you don't have a ton of budget, and you don't handle secrets very often. Most of the time you're just writing innocuous emails and running expense reports. But occasionally you get some missive on a floppy disk marked for your eyes only, and you need to look at it. Well, if you stick that disk in your desktop, it turns into a pumpkin. That machine's secure now, so it can't be plugged into a normal phone line. No one can be in the same room with it unless they have clearance, which none of your guys have. Suddenly your PC's just radioactive. And this wouldn't be a problem if you had a second machine for daily use and could keep the secure one locked up somewhere, but you don't have the space or money for that, so what do? Well, IBM's suggestion seems to have been the 10 megabyte internal removable cartridge disk drive offered exclusively, I think, with the EMR-PC lineup. Now this is actually a rebadged version of a SyQuest SQ312, a removable disk system that stored 10 megs of data on essentially a hard drive platter in a cartridge. These were notionally as good as any other hard drive, so you could keep your whole OS and data on one like normal, but since they're removable, the clearing procedure is to just eject the disk. And you can see how this solves the problem, right? The boss can use this machine for unsecure work all day long, but when something comes in that needs clearance, he powers off the PC, locks his door, opens a safe, swaps the unsecure cartridge for a secure one, and boots back up again. He does whatever he needs to do, then powers off, swaps the disks back, and once the safe is locked, the room isn't a secure environment anymore. It's a really nice solution, and really the only one that could ever have worked, which is why everyone was doing it. I mentioned earlier that other companies were making Tempest PCs, and one of those was actually COMSEC, who partnered with a company named Laurel Corp in 1985 to make the COMSEC Laurel 3100T, a hardened version of the COMSEC Portable 286. And that too had a removable hard drive, which COMSEC said was for exactly this purpose. So there you go. Intriguingly though, that drive sure looks like an ordinary half-height 20 megabyte disk in a removable sled, and one wonders why IBM didn't choose the same solution, since the SiQuest only stored 10 megs. That would have been pretty small even in 85, but by 87 it was absurd given that 40 and 80 meg drives were available, and the smallest fixed disk you could get was 20. On top of that, a standard 20 megabyte disk was about $1,000, at least in IBM's catalog, while the SiQuest cost twice that much and stored half as much data. And I mean, sure, there were plenty of applications for which they didn't need that much storage, but it'd be absurd not to offer it when another company already had 2 years earlier, right? Right. So, this is strange, but they did have a solution. One of the options IBM offered for the EMR-AT was a pair of SiQuests, fortunately sold at a significant discount. And I think this was a kind of consolation prize, since it did get you back up to 20 megs. I mean, you were paying over 3 times as much, but, well, I guess I don't really have a but. This just seems bad. Anyway, though, that appears to have been their solution, but it created a new problem. Each of those SiQuests took up a standard, well, now standard half-height bay. So if you were going to fit in 2 of those, plus a floppy drive, which were still mandatory, you were going to need 3 bays. And since this was all removable storage, all 3 had to be exposed, hence the larger cutout in the faceplate. It's a real shaggy dog explanation, but there you have it. This configuration would seem to have been quite common. You can see it depicted in IBM's docs for the EMR-AT, as well as the single specimen that's listed on eBay right now, and that seems concerning because these SiQuests have even more electronics on board, even closer to the front of the drive. They would have to be leaky as hell, so I'm still not sure how IBM solved for this. My best guess is that I'm just not seeing all there is to it. IBM's price sheet mentions that the various accessories had been tempested, so I'd guess that the SiQuest drives were heavily shielded, and the same was probably true for the floppy drives, just not this one. This drive appears to be totally ordinary. It looks like every other IBM floppy drive I've ever seen. It's a YD380, a common model. It's got a 1988 date stamp and an IBM part number, so this definitely came in some IBM machine, but I suspect not this one. As I hinted at earlier, I'm sure this machine was in some other collector's hands before I got it, and if the original floppy drive died, they may have just swapped it out for a functionally equivalent model pulled from an AT and thrown away the incredibly rare tempested version. So, in the absence of any proof either way, I'm going to assume that IBM shielded all their accessories and did so thoroughly that they considered them adequate sealing for the drive bay. I don't see what other explanation there could be. Okay, and I'm inserting a pickup here because while I was editing this video, someone put up an eBay listing that sort of confirms my suspicions. This SiQuest drive appears to be fully shielded, and I don't know if this is actually the Tempest version or if SiQuest just decided to make it more robust in later revisions, but this would clearly solve the problems I'm talking about. So let's just assume that this is what IBM was shipping in the TPCs. And either way, at this point, I think we've established that the machine is sealed up pretty dang tight. It seems like very few signals could possibly escape from it. And that leaves us with a new set of problems because, well, how do we get signals in and out on purpose? After all, the machine isn't self-contained. Although, if it was, that'd be real convenient, which is why nowadays they often are. So, let's take a brief detour into the current state of the art. As I said earlier, Tempest is still a concern today, so there are still Tempest-hardened machines being made, and the neat thing about that is that a lot of the companies making them have websites and just talk about their products openly. I mean, why not, right? Like, They're selling not only to the government, but also to all their contractors and probably to some ordinary businesses. I mean, I made a crack earlier about selling this stuff to coke-brained 80s executives, but I'd be shocked if NVIDIA headquarters doesn't have its own SCIF. Though, on that point, let's take a second to define that term because it's actually really important. SCIF, or SCIF, is a term you'll hear a lot when reading about modern state-level InfoSec because it's really kind of a panacea for eavesdropping, of all kinds, that is, not just electronic. The term stands for Sensitive Compartmented Information Facility, and essentially what it means is a room, or sometimes a building, or sometimes just a cargo container, that's been designated as a safe place to discuss and handle secrets. The concept is defined that broadly because a lot of eavesdropping isn't electronic. Would-be spies glance over people's shoulders, use telescopes to look through windows, and listen at doors. And meanwhile, people with secrets to keep sometimes drop or misplace documents, or discuss things when they think they're alone, but they aren't. The SCIF solves through all of this through largely simple mechanisms. It's a room with no windows, heavy soundproofing, and usually just one entrance with keycard-controlled access and an armed guard. So nobody goes in unless they're supposed to be in, and you never discuss secrets until you're in. The envelopes stay sealed until the door is shut and locked, and if you do drop one page from your secret dossier, at least it's going to be in there and not out in an unsecured hallway. And that's sort of the model here. Not everything discussed in a SCIF is the highest level of secrecy, but because it's a tightly controlled space, the people in charge know exactly who's present during the discussion of what information, and that makes it a lot easier to control where information goes. So obviously these are very popular with the government. They have tons of the things, and while some literally are repurposed shipping containers, others are dressed up to look like perfectly ordinary rooms. The White House Situation Room, for instance, is a SCIF. You just never know it. So not all of this is about electronics, but naturally that is a big concern, and SCIFs are generally built with EMI countermeasures, most significantly a crapload of shielding. How much varies depending on the security rating of the facility, but all of them are designed to prevent most RF from escaping, or to at least attenuate it so heavily that it's much more difficult to pick up from a distance. And distance is what does the rest of the work. It's hard to pick up useful signals from a few hundred yards away, so if you just shoot anyone who gets within that range, you never have a problem to begin with. The SCIF approach is thus very effective and very convenient because shielding an entire room is a lot easier than shielding every individual device. Consider again the White House Situation Room. It's full of TVs. If every one of those had to be Tempest rated, then they'd all cost an unholy fortune, and when one broke, you'd have to pay through the nose to repair or replace it. And the same goes for computers, phones, cameras, you name it. Everything in the room would cost 10 times as much. On the other hand, if you just shield the whole room, then you can use normal off-the-shelf hardware, and even if it's leaky as hell, none of that spill can get out. This makes the gear used in SCIFs much cheaper, which is why you often see totally normal-looking office PCs in photos of secure facilities. And so, naturally, we've been doing this forever. I found an article in Cryptolog 1983 talking about the NSA's Operations Building 2A, a structure built with top-to-bottom shielding. And the author said they had plans to retrofit several other buildings the same way. He also says that old-timers would know this concept by the term screen room. And when I looked that up, I found a report by the United States Communications Security Board from 1961 that used the same term. And I should point out that this report contained no mention of computers. What they were concerned about were teletypes, which might have been used to talk to mainframes, but more likely were just being used to send messages on secure lines. I'm not sure what their eventual solution was, but putting the machines in screen rooms certainly would have been a quick fix, so I'd guess that was the short-term solution. So SCIFs are a great idea, but they're not always practical. Maybe you don't have the funding or the space for one, or maybe you're in a temporary facility, or maybe you're in a war zone. You can't always drag a personal Faraday cage around with you, and that's why Tempest-hardened PCs existed in the first place. None of these needs have changed over the years. Sometimes you just need a computer that doesn't emit anything to begin with. So companies are still building these, and boy, have they gotten ugly. This is the DTD E5470, a Tempest-rated laptop sold by CIS Secure, a manufacturer of many Tempested devices, and what you're looking at is, in fact, a Dell Latitude E5470, a common off-the-shelf business laptop, or at least the guts from one. They bought this machine off the shelf, disassembled it, and put the parts into a custom chassis which looks to have been made entirely from machined aluminum. The result looks like a prop from Marathon. I mean, the paint job's all wrong, and I'm talking about the new one, not the old one, but look, it has the same design language as like the Blender default cube, okay? And I know a bunch of you are getting ready to type, wow, all laptops should look like that. I want one, but come on, let's be real. You ever try to use a Panasonic Toughbook? It seems like a cool idea for about 10 minutes, and then you realize those things are miserable to interact with. The keyboards and mice are terrible, and the screens are blurry. You couldn't pay me enough to use one. But on that point, CIS actually used to resell those as well. So here's a CF52 that's also been totally repackaged. Although this time around, I think this is cast aluminum or maybe magnesium, judging from the damage near the front corner. And this thing also looks miserable to use, but all these hardened laptops offer one huge advantage that makes it all worthwhile. They're laptops. And that means that what you see is all you need. You can do at least basic computing tasks without plugging in any external components, since the monitor, keyboard, and mouse are all integrated. Now, I'm not sure how those parts can be secure, since they sure look like the standard Dell or Panasonic components, and I can't really picture how CIS would have shielded those, but let's just assume they know what they're doing. Either they couldn't get any useful EMI off these parts to begin with, or they did some kind of voodoo magic to make them safe. Either way, even if the keyboards leak, the rest of the machine is clearly sealed up tight. And to give you an idea how tight, check this out. The CF52 hails from the early 2010s when optical drives weren't yet optional. So there's a flap you can open to get to the DVD-ROM, and it warns you that with that flap open, the machine is no longer secure. This is a big enough hole for RF to escape through. So I guess if you're going to load software on one of these things, you need to go into a SCIF before you open this door. So yeah, there's obvious limitations, but this is clearly a nice self-contained solution. It's not the whole solution though, because sometimes you need power you can't get in a laptop form factor. And for that, we have hardened desktops like this one from a company named Equipto. This is a monstrous metal box that you would never confuse for a PC until you pop the cover. Turns out these things are built either from off-the-shelf parts, like your Asus motherboard and whatnot, or from the innards of standard Dell or HP office machines. So just like our EMR-AT, all the parts are stock, and the only real change they've made is to the chassis. Though, that's quite a chassis. Per the feature list, this claims to offer 120 decibel shielding for signals up to 6 gigahertz and says this may eliminate the need to operate from a SCIF. And yeah, I'd think so. 120 dB means that it reduces the signal strength by a factor of 1,000,000, so that would probably do it. But before you can do anything with this machine, you're obviously going to have to plug in a monitor, a keyboard, a mouse, etc., maybe even a network cable. And that's a real problem because now you need to put holes in the case and then plug antennas into them. Well, okay, so consumer grade cables are typically all shielded these days, but that shielding doesn't necessarily extend all the way to the connector and the host machine, and it may not be up to snuff for military needs anyway. If you look at a USB port, for instance, I mean, sure, the connector's metal. It is notionally shielded, but it's very thin, and there's gaps around the plug, and then usually gaps between the plug and the PC's chassis, and then who knows if the shielding on the cable is truly continuous end to end. There are potential leaks all over the place. And the same goes for DisplayPort, RJ45 Ethernet, basically everything. The tolerances on commodity grade cables and connectors are crap. So job one is to get much higher quality cables. We'll just assume the Army pays 5 to 10 times as much as we do and move on from that one. But then there's the plugs, which you can't really fix. The consumer ones are just too crappy, so you need something totally different. So when we look at the plugs on this machine, they're pretty weird looking. It's hard to make out exactly what they used, but the connectors on the front, I can tell you, those are known, well, they're just known as military connectors, and they're very heavy duty. They're circular, multi-pin, die-cast things with loads of shielding, and I couldn't tell you what plugs into those, but if we look at the back, things are a little clearer. Mouse, keyboard, LAN. We could just assume that these are USB, and Ethernet, but what are these connectors? Well, the first two I can tell you are just caps over standard DE9 plugs. These are also known as DB9s, or to some people, serial ports. But these and other D-sub connectors show up all over Tempest rated gear because D-subs just kick ass. The D-sub miniature connector originated back in the 50s or 60s, somewhere like that. And it became the de facto plug for basically everything on computers well up into the 90s because it was very robust in mechanical, electrical, and emissive terms. In other words, they're very sturdy, they have fasteners so they won't fall out, they make very reliable connections, and they're really well shielded. A D-sub connector has a metal shell that fully encapsulates all its pins, and which mates very deeply around a matching shell on the receptacle side. So when connected, you have two intermeshed metal shields, which can both be attached to ground, forming a continuous envelope around all the signal pins through which basically nothing can escape. It's much like the sort of labyrinth seal I described in the EMR-AT's lid. RF would have to bounce all the way around this very tight gap to escape, and that's just not likely. So if you want a totally radio-tight connection, the D-sub was already a pretty good choice, and because it's been in production for 9 million years, you can get them for pennies. So if you're a vendor making Tempest gear, the first thing you're going to do is replace as many plugs as you can with these things. And that goes beyond computers. CIS Secure is actually known mostly for their secure voice over IP phones, and their modified Cisco 7962 actually uses a DE9 plug for the handset, which is bizarre to look at, but makes perfect sense since you just can't shield an RJ9 plug. So likewise, what Equipto has done here is swapped out two of the USB ports on this machine with DE9 connectors, and well, obviously that would necessitate modified keyboards and mice with those plugs on them, but well, you were going to need those anyway since all your peripherals would also need to be hardened, so this problem solves itself. But some things are a bit tougher. This LAN plug, for instance, that's a total mystery to me. I honestly don't know what this is. I tried Googling it. I tried Google lensing it, but nothing came up. I think it's just a bit too generic looking, but what this might be is a fiber optic connector. And this is another popular theme in the Tempest space, because the only thing better than shielded cable is no cable at all. I've actually read that many SCIFs have no metallic penetrations through the walls. Ethernet, radio, cable TV, phones, you name it, everything that goes in or out travels over fiber optics because they don't radiate. I mean, technically, light is still radio waves, but they're up in the hundreds of terahertz, and for some reason that doesn't produce any detectable emissions. So for all intents and purposes, fiber optic cables are perfectly secure. So if you could use those for every single connection to your hardened system, that'd make for a really safe machine. But, well, for one thing, a lot of peripherals need power to operate, so you're gonna have to run copper anyway, and a keyboard is relatively easy to shield, so for that, and several other reasons, not everything gets the fiber treatment. But where possible, optical connections are preferred. Indeed, if we go back to the CIS Toughbook, the back panel is all D-subs for the USB and video and whatnot, but then on the rear corner, we have a standard fiber Ethernet port. And the same is apparently true for the CIS Latitude, although they didn't have a picture of it. However, I did find another machine from the same company, some sort of thin client, which uses fiber to connect monitors. This thing has a DisplayPort to fiber converter tucked inside of it, and they sell a special display and a custom case with a built-in converter to go the other way, and this may all sound completely absurd, but, well, as you saw from my demo earlier, it might actually be a worthy investment, because it's not paranoia if they are out to get you, and even less so if they know how to do it. So, optical connections. Great work if you can get it, but unfortunately, the EMR-AT mostly predates fiber interconnects. I mean, they were definitely around, and in fact, in 1988, a company started selling fiber Ethernet cards specifically for Tempest customers, but I have no idea if those actually made it to market, and for the most part, fiber wasn't yet available at a scale and cost that could be easily squirreled away inside, a PC and its peripherals. So IBM had to solve this problem some other way. I'm not sure how many of their Tempested peripherals ever existed. There were probably lots from other suppliers, but the only IBM ones I know about are the keyboard and monitor that shipped with this machine. And the keyboard is simple enough, so we'll look at that first. This is the TPC Keyboard 4, and from the outside it looks like a perfectly ordinary IBM Model F, although there were two revisions of that, the XT and the AT version. This is definitely the second though, which you can tell because of the gap between the enter key and the numpad block. So if we put the TPC keyboard next to another AT Model F, they are externally completely identical. And internally, well, they still haven't really done that much. The big steel plate, for instance, that's actually normal for Model Fs. So the only changes seem to be the copper tape, which they applied over the control board, and the shield braid fitted over the end of the cable. They didn't add any shielding to the rest of the case, which I suspect is because the only thing radiating off the main PCB would be the matrix scanning signals, which well, maybe those are too low frequency to be picked up effectively. On the other hand, though, the microprocessor on the control board, which interprets the scanning matrix and sends the results to the computer, is a totally different story. I couldn't tell you the details on that chip, but I'm sure it runs at a frequency high enough to produce legible EMI, so they just mummified it in copper tape, which they also carefully wrapped around the metal braid connected to the cable. This would be attached to the shielding foil inside the cable in order to keep it continuous all the way from the cord to the board and ensure there's no leakage. Then, of course, at the other end of the cable, we have another DE9 plug, and I'm not exactly sure why that is. The original PC keyboard used a 5-pin DIN plug, and those were available in a fully metallic package. In fact, early Model F boards used that type of connector, so I'm not sure why it wouldn't be adequate here. The only guesses I have are that maybe IBM couldn't find a really high quality socket for the PC end, like one that's sealed perfectly to the chassis, or they didn't like the fact that this couldn't be bolted into the machine. DIN plugs could be pulled out by accident, and that would leave a hole that could conceivably leak EMI, so maybe that's it, I'm not sure. In any case, though, it seems the keyboard is unchanged other than those two minor things. So let's move on to the monitor, where they did a little bit more. Since this machine came with either CGA or EGA graphics, IBM would have included the 4453 EMR display. Now, I don't have one of those, but one of my patrons has a 4451, which is the Tempested version of the MDA monitor. I fortunately do have an MDA monitor, so they were happy to send me pictures of the insides to compare, and yeah, this would make a pretty easy game of spot the differences, huh? In the EMR version, the entire rear end of the tube has been entombed in an aluminum box. This is clearly shielding, which makes sense because this houses one of the most critical elements of the whole display, the neck board. It's called that because, as you can see in the ordinary MDA monitor, the board plugs directly onto the neck of the tube using a little round multi-pin plug. The circuitry on this board then takes the low voltage video signal coming from the PC and amplifies it to drive the CRT's electron gun. That means that this little board is emitting a much hotter copy of the video signal, and I'd guess this is the precise source of the signals Van Eck was eavesdropping on. So sealing this up was paramount, and they clearly spared no expense. This is a very robust enclosure with every gap either welded or bolted shut, and it's so substantial that it has to be supported by this huge gantry wrapped around the tube. I'd guess this let pretty much nothing out, but, well, we still have to get the signal in to drive the tube. Now, on an ordinary MDA monitor, the cable enters the case, then plugs into the chassis board, which is this big PCB over on the side with most of the circuitry on it, where it gets processed before being fed back out to the neck board. That exposes a good, 8 to 10 inches of wire, though, which is no bueno, so in the Tempest version, the cable goes straight into the neckboard case through a gland seal so that no wires are ever exposed. Trouble is, some of those wires are needed by the chassis board, so it can generate the drive signals for the magnetic yokes, synchronize the flyback, and modulate the strength of the electron beam. So all around the edges of the box are solder terminals where various signals exit and jump over to the chassis board. And this seems counterproductive, right? Like, if they went to all that bother to contain these signals, why just send them right back out again? Well, I'm not sure, but I do have some speculation. My first guess was that the only signals leaving here are the H and V sync lines. Those don't really contain any information. They just tell the monitor when to begin each vertical and horizontal scan, and you can't derive anything useful by spying on those, so this would still be safe. The trouble is, from what I've read of the schematic from the normal monitor, the raw video signal actually gets fed straight into the chassis board to do something. I'm not exactly sure what. I think it might modulate the beam intensity, but either way, I suspect that's what this white lead is. That's actually a tiny coaxial cable, which are commonly used for low power RF signals. So I think this carries the image from the PC to the chassis board. That's the most sensitive signal in the whole thing, and it's just leaving containment right here. How is this not a problem? Well, assuming that is what this is, I'd guess that the box is only there to contain the amplified signal, the one that gets fed into the electron gun. What comes out here is probably the raw feed from the computer, pre-amplification, and sure, that is going to radiate off the wire and off the chassis board, but that probably wasn't actually an issue. See, at this point, you're probably thinking to yourself that there really should be a lot more metal in here, right? I mean, sure, there's the big armature around the tube, but that's clearly just supporting the weight of the neckboard box. It's not solid enough to do any shielding on its own. And the chassis board, that's completely exposed. This seems underbuilt, not just in comparison to the Tempest PC, but like to FCC requirements. This looks like it should be leaking signal all over the place, but I don't think that was true even for the normal consumer version. See, something you might have noticed is that the inside of the monitor's plastic case is black. And that's actually a coating very similar to the stuff used on CRTs themselves. There, it's referred to as aquadag, or colloidal graphite, and it's used to coat the inside and outside of the tube to make those surfaces conductive. Now, that's essential for CRTs to work at all, since the inner coating acts as the tube's primary anode, completing the circuit that makes it function, and most tubes also have it on the outside for a variety of reasons, but very few TVs or monitors have it applied to the inside of the case. At least none that I've seen. And I don't know if this is specifically aquadag, but it's definitely something similar because if I put a multimeter on it, there's virtually no resistance. And it seems obvious to me that IBM applied this stuff to turn the whole case into a shield. I don't know that graphite is as effective as metal for that purpose, but there is some indication that it's commonly done, and the coating does cover absolutely everything. The only exception is a couple vents on the top and bottom, one of which actually has a supplementary metal grate over it, and of course the opening where the tube is exposed on the front, although that's not a problem since CRTs are made out of glass impregnated with heavy metals. If that can stop X-rays from cooking your face, it can definitely block some wimpy little radio waves. So this monitor would seem to be pretty airtight. You might wonder, though, why IBM took this approach instead of, say, switching to an all-metal case. That might sound kind of outrageous, but I mean, a lot of commercial displays had metal cases. I even have a little 12-inch multi-sync monitor from the late 80s with a nice curved bezel, and the entire thing is made of heavy steel. So this is definitely doable, and it seems like it would have been a surer bet, but I think they didn't bother because they'd already found out that it wasn't necessary. See, this photo with the multimeter isn't from the 4451. It's from a standard MDA monitor, the one they sold to consumers. Not all of them were like this, though. The monitor in my personal collection has bare plastic on the inside, while others I saw online seemed to have this black coating, so I went out and found another specimen, and sure enough, it had the stuff. So my assumption is that IBM didn't use this coating at first, but once the displays were in production for a while, either they happened to discover EMI issues they hadn't noticed, or the FCC tightened their requirements and the display was no longer compliant. So as a quick fix, they just updated their assembly process to add this coating. Now, if the testing from that experience showed that the graphite adequately contained the low-level signals and, attenuated the heck out of the high-level ones, then there was no need to harden the case any further. All they had to do was add the neckboard case to completely eradicate the amplified signals, and they were good to go without having to retool their whole production line. And that would really be ideal since they didn't actually have a production line for the 4451. If we look closely at the chassis board in this thing, we can see that some of the wires have been snipped off, leaving the pins still in the plug. This suggests that the 4451 was produced by pulling finished MDA monitors out of the warehouse and modifying them by hand, which is a pretty inefficient process. So Had they designed this thing from scratch, maybe they'd have put, a box around the chassis board just for the hell of it, or even used an all-metal case. But since they were doing it this way, they really wanted to keep the number of changes to a minimum. And that just makes me even more curious about the one seemingly unnecessary change they did make. While the standard MDA monitor just runs off a big dumb transformer, that's been replaced here with what I guess is a switch mode power supply. I couldn't get any hits on the part numbers, but it just feels that way from the vibes and the company name Converter Concepts. But this kind of feels like overkill. I mean, it's a really big supply unit that's only putting out a couple amps, and it must have cost a chunk of change, so I'm not sure why they bothered. Maybe it was some kind of government design requirement, who knows. In any case though, we now have a pair of peripherals that perfectly complement the EMR-AT. So we just have to get them connected to the machine, which is easier said than done. Obviously the cables are shielded, as is the computer itself, but the point where the two meet is critical. As the borderline between secure and unsecure spaces, the back panel has to be absolutely watertight. And the original ATs wasn't. I mean, to IBM's credit, it wasn't half bad. The case was a more or less solid metal box, and they tried pretty hard to keep it sealed by, for instance, using an add-on card design with a bracket that wrapped all the way around the top of the card cage, and by providing blank filler plates for any unused drive bays and expansion slots. Since all those plates were screwed down to bare metal, they functioned as part of the case and helped maintain its crude Faraday cage properties. So, by most standards, the AT was sealed up pretty tight, but not enough for the DoD. We already addressed the myriad gaps in the AT chassis, for which they had to build a whole new case, but they couldn't even keep the card cage design because the brackets on PC add-on cards are only bolted down in one spot, right at the top. At the bottom, they're just loosely retained by a notch that lets them scoot side to side and twist, and both the cards and the very thin support fingers between slots can easily get bent, creating gaps. That won't do, so IBM designed something far more robust for this machine. This I/O panel is so chunky that it's actually a modular component, so I'm going to remove it because there's a lot to look at. This thing is another hunk of die-cast aluminum, much like the top cover. And as you can see, it lets you mount D subs or D subs. That's it. If you want to use something else, that's just too bad. Although in practical terms, this probably wasn't much of a problem. While the world of PC add-ons certainly contained a bewildering variety of strange connectors, most common PC cards were already using either DE9 or DB25, so it wasn't asking too much to limit the back panel to just those connectors, and it was far easier to seal as a result, or at least that was usually the case. As we can see from the diagram in the maintenance guide, the EMR-AT's rear panel should have a couple more DB25s on the right side, while this one has these two round caps. When I saw those, I thought, oh, cool, I can water cool this thing. But on re-examining, these are probably meant for optional BNC connectors, I would guess for the funky mainframe interface used on the 3270 variant of this thing. So what this panel is doing on this computer, I have no idea. We're just gonna pretend those aren't there. Most of the cutouts on this back panel have had couplers mounted to them. That is to say, back-to-back connectors. So we've got a plug sticking out here, and then there's a second one on the back here that these jumper cables plug into. And this isn't actually necessary. As you can see, this cable here is mounted directly to the panel, but the couplers make it easy to swap out the jumper cables, and they seal to the panel much better. As you can see, the specific couplers that IBM chose have these great big flanges around the outside that completely cover up any gap, whereas this connector here doesn't have that, so they had to add a piece of foil underneath it to cover up the opening. Then, whichever cutouts aren't being used at the moment get covered by these blank filler plates, which on the back are held in with either 2 or 3 bolts to make absolutely certain that they're held flat to the case with no gaps. The end result is that this back panel is sealed up so tight that the jumper cables themselves don't even need to be shielded. Even though this space in here is sort of walled off from the rest of the inner cavity, it's still considered part of the hot zone. So these cables can safely emit all over the place, and they do. But there were apparently still some concerns with leakage on the outside. Now, as I said earlier, a mated pair of D-subs should, by all rights, be pretty much watertight, but it seems like IBM either tested and found that wasn't true, or they were just paranoid, because there's actually a couple more layers of protection here. You notice the shiny grid behind these connectors? Sort of like the stuff on the back of the panel that goes over the fixed drive bay. That is a flexible mat with an embedded metal grid, which is connected to the chassis. That's all grounded. And as far as I can tell, this is here because some of IBM's custom peripherals had a very special connector with braided metal wire surrounding the plug. I found this on the cable for one of the EMR displays that was on eBay, though on none of the other peripherals I've looked at, so it seems to have been optional for some reason. But I would guess that when you connect one of these and run the screws down, that braid gets compressed against this mesh, creating basically a conformal seal that RF can't possibly escape through. Then, if that wasn't enough, the D-sub couplers also have these little spring steel fingers that make absolutely certain the shells on the plug and socket are in contact. Was this a real problem? I guess so, because they felt the need to solve it, but man, it feels like overkill. Then, just in case 10 bolts wasn't enough to hold this thing flat to the chassis, the whole panel has this braided metal gasket running all around the periphery. It's honestly a preposterous level of paranoia, but again, I have to imagine they wouldn't have bothered unless they found leakage in testing, and really, that's what's so neat about this machine, if there is anything. This video started out with a premise that may have seemed more exciting, right? Let's look at a secret Cold War military computer, woo! But at this point, you've probably picked up that it's really kind of boring. There's no mysterious circuitry, there's no 007 gadgets, there's no switch that turns on a signal jammer. It's just a PC AT in a less convenient case. And on that note, you probably don't want to own one of these. It's really not very fun to tinker with. So if there is anything exciting about this machine, it's just a matter of getting to see all this attention to detail. The original PC had lots of gaps all over the place, but this one has none. And to make sure of that, they used whichever techniques were necessary. Welded sheet metal where that worked, die cast where more heft was needed, flexible materials where rigid ones wouldn't do, and so on. They bothered to use captive bolts on the lid, so there was less chance of losing one and putting the machine back together half-ass, right? It's not exactly cost no object design. They clearly didn't spend a penny they didn't have to and reused whichever parts they could, but the minimum viable product here demanded a much more expensive chassis where everything was more or less done right. And it's just neat to see that. In functional terms, though, it really is no different from a normal AT, and I think that was probably on purpose. The desired product here was, after all, a standard computer that was just EMI safe. It would make no sense for it to work any differently. So, having explained all this, I have nothing actually remarkable to show you. I'm just messing with ya. You know I wouldn't make you sit through 2 hours of lecture without any payoff, and today's is worth it. Obviously, the question on everyone's minds is, how well does this work, and was it really necessary to go this hardcore? But that's kind of hard to prove, at least if you're me. In fact, I almost didn't make this video because I couldn't think of a way to prove it. See, I don't even really own this machine. It was loaned to me by the local used computer store, RePC, but even though I was the one who found it buried in the back room and drug it out and tested it, I was just gonna leave it there because I couldn't think of a proper way to demo it. And you might not consider that important. Maybe you enjoyed the last 2 hours of me just talking without proving anything I was saying. But personally, I felt like doing all that and then just saying, trust me, it probably works, was so underwhelming that I would rather just send this thing back out into the world and hope somebody else does a better job. I mean, how would I even do it, right? Like, if I had an EMI testing rig, you know, like an anechoic chamber with a bunch of antennas plugged into $50,000 boxes from Agilent, then maybe we could make like California and do some emissions testing, but I don't know shit about any of that. Even if someone else did it for me, I wouldn't even know how to read the results. And more importantly, it's just kind of boring. This is a video. We want something more visceral. But unfortunately, the pickings are real slim. Earlier, I did show you a brief demo of Tempest principles by intercepting the video signal from a monitor, but that trick only works on LCD displays, which we can't plug into this thing and which aren't contemporary anyway. There are also some other projects out there which work with signals from CRT monitors, but they require VGA graphics and they need you to run a program on the target machine under Linux, which is not going to work on a 286. So none of those will work, and that's fine really, because none of them would really tell us anything about this computer, just about its peripherals. We want something that proves whether the PC itself is effectively shielded, but nobody's ever made anything like that. Until now. A few weeks ago, I went and complained to one of my smartest friends about how frustrating it was to have access to one of these incredibly rare and fascinating machines, but no way to show it off properly. They went and dug around on my behalf, but also came up with nothing useful. And then a few days later, they popped up and sent me BUSRADIO.exe, proving yet again that the best way to solve a problem on the computer is to get real mad that nobody else has yet. So what's BUSRADIO do? Exactly what it says on the tin. Okay, so here's the machine. It's running DOS 5.0, and here is an ordinary consumer AM/FM radio, which I'm recording into this Tascam. Now I'm going to run a batch file that I baked before the show, and then set this up here. And I think that really speaks for itself, doesn't it? Well, okay, probably not. Probably an awful lot of folks could use an explanation. And I can sort of provide one, though I'm a bit fuzzy on the details. What I can tell you is that this radio is tuned to about, 580, about 600 kilohertz on the AM band. And the sound you heard, a poor rendering of Pachelbel's Canon in D, is being produced by writing values to system memory at a very specific cadence, which causes the AT motherboard's data bus to produce a crudely modulated AM radio signal. Now that part is straightforward enough. What I don't get is why that signal can also be picked up at many other places on the AM dial, albeit at very different intensities and with different tones. I guess those are what radio people call harmonics. And there are actually some other oddities we'll address in a minute, but for the moment, let's stick to the juicy stuff and talk about what we're actually proving here and what we aren't. See, what I've just done is one of those very impressive demos that the guy from the NSA was describing, like the HDMI intercept from earlier. It is a jarring way to illustrate that a computer can wirelessly transmit intelligible data, but it might not seem like the best demo for a couple of reasons. First, we're running a special program here that's designed to make the machine tell on itself. So this is sort of like saying, hey, did you know if your computer has a virus, it's no longer safe? Like, duh. Who knew, right? But there are still some good points to be made here. Made, that's a good one, me. No, seriously though, the InfoSec community has long recognized a vulnerability that they, honest to God, call the evil maid attack, in which a would-be attacker infiltrates a high-security facility by getting an agent installed as a low-ranking employee with nonetheless broad access, like a janitor or a maid, or by compromising an existing employee. Cleaning staff and the like have physical access to a lot of sensitive areas, often with very little supervision, and while they might not be able to get their hands on, say, a disk cartridge locked in a safe, they might be able to sneak a program, like this one, onto the boot drive for a secure computer, and that has its advantages. We talked a lot in this video about how it might be possible to decipher the signals inadvertently put off by a computer, but it's a hell of a lot easier if you can just make the computer transmit them deliberately. A standard radio modulation is much easier to reliably decode than random computer bus noise, and the fact that it can be picked up with commodity equipment is even kind of a boon in itself. If you're a Soviet spy in 1987 and the feds raid your apartment, it'd be nice if they found nothing except an off-the-shelf radio and tape recorder rather than a bunch of specialized receiving equipment. So, while I don't know what the state of the art is these days, I'd guess this is or was a common area of exploitation. So it's valid enough, but we do need to address the other problem, which is we're testing this with the case open. With no shielding at all, probably nobody's shocked that the machine is leaking signal all over the place. And indeed, the situation is much worse than it even appears. In fact, the only reason I actually bothered with the BUSRADIO app was to make this demonstration more obvious. The AT board is actually so noisy that you can do this demo with no special software or equipment. See, if I reboot the machine and we listen closely, you hear all this crap? That's the sound of the post-process happening. As the BIOS probes all the various hardware components and tests the system memory, it produces this distinct series of tones, which you could absolutely learn to recognize even with the naked ear. Anyone who grew up with dial-up internet can tell you it's not hard to memorize certain patterns of coded data. I mean, we used to know whether a modem handshake was progressing at 56K or 33.6, just depending on the cadence. And now that you've heard a post, you could definitely recognize it again, right? And likewise, when we get to the boot process, that also makes a distinct sound. So it would seem that the basic modulation of the signal isn't even being performed by our little program. The machine seems to be doing it all on its own. It appears that the 8 megahertz PCAT just inadvertently emits, well, at the moment I have this tuned to 810 kilohertz. That seems to be the strongest frequency for the bus activity itself. I guess it's putting out an 810 kilohertz AM carrier at all times. And since all activity on the bus does something to perturb that, an awful lot of activity gets transmitted into the ether as legible signals. We might only be able to work out the broadest strokes with the naked ear, but if I had a radio with special filters and a digital signal processor, I bet I could get a ton of information out of this thing. But again, we already knew the situation inside the machine sucked. This just proves even harder that shielding is vital. So the question we really should be asking is, how much shielding do we need? Even the original AT was protected better than this, so how well did its case mitigate the problem? Well, let's find out. So just to make sure nothing's changed, let's go ahead and test it with the case off. If anything, it's worse. Wow. All right, now let's put the case on. Oh, wow. Even with the radio sitting by the side, you can hear the difference. Okay, so it's definitely making a difference. I love putting on these cases. It's so easy. There we go. All right, now let's try again. Well, yeah, that's pretty much nothing. Well, at least from above the machine. If we check behind, yeah, that's pretty bad. And then if we put this in front, right here next to the LEDs. Oh, do we have to turn it around? Might have to turn it around. Yeah, there it is, clear as day. So yeah, when I said that IBM's original case design was a surprisingly good effort, that seems to be true for the most part. The emissions are largely being contained, but we're still getting very strong leakage out of the front and back. This is totally unacceptable for the NSA. So how much better does the Tempest version fare? Well, as we saw already, with the lid off, we get the signal loud and clear, so let's put the lid on. Let's just check. Yeah, there's nothing at all. From above the machine, beside the machine, behind the machine, yeah, we've got absolutely nothing. Although, if we put the radio up near the LED panel, let's see, where is it? It's up there somewhere. Do I need to turn it around? Is that the situation? There it is. It's faint, but it's still there. Can we stick those tape decks under it? Ah, terrific. So yeah, obviously the ceiling isn't perfect. I mean, it makes a big difference, as you'll see if we lift the lid. Yeah, it's night and day. But even with the lid on, we still get a detectable melody, and I'm not exactly sure why. Clearly there's something coupling the signal outside the case, but what is that thing? I couldn't tell you. Still, I think we got what we were looking for. Our question was whether all this overbuilding was necessary, and the answer is clearly yes. Even this deeply unscientific test proves that conclusively. It'd be great to have the hard numbers, but we don't really need them. The reduction in leakage is clearly dramatic, and while we are still picking up something, that was inevitable. The idea of perfect shielding, as I understand it, is a fake idea. It's extremely difficult to eliminate the entirety of a signal, but what's still escaping here is so quiet that it probably couldn't be picked up reliably from more than a few feet away. So as long as you're still applying the distance part of the Tempest equation, this is genuinely good enough. And on top of that, we aren't even seeing these protections at maximum efficiency. I really hope this comes through in the recording because it's pretty subtle, but while putting the lid on does make a huge difference in the signal strength, it actually gets even fainter when I run in the screws. Gonna be quiet here, we'll see if we can hear it. Oh yeah, there we go. I think that was audible. That's half as loud, maybe a quarter as loud. It's a tremendous difference in any case. And I'm pretty sure the fact that these effects are perceivable at all by the naked ear means that we're increasing the effectiveness of this shielding by orders of magnitude just by tightening some screws. And that means that everything IBM did, all the attention to detail, did serve a purpose. It really is this hard to bottle up a radio signal. And what's fascinating about that is that nothing has really changed about it in 40 years. I'm sure EMI mitigation techniques have improved a little, and I'm sure the particulars of the issue have changed due to the massive leap in operating frequencies, but physics are physics. Radio waves and shielding are universal constants. So I'd guess that if you retrofitted a modern computer into this thing, it would still do a pretty good job, at least up to a point. The holes in the vents might be too big to contain signals in the multi-gigahertz range, but I'm sure you could mitigate that with some metal screening. And I'd love to see someone test that formally, but I don't think anyone ever will because, for whatever reason, none of us care about this problem. For reasons I don't really understand, the EMI mitigations in modern PCs are laughable. Most gamer rigs these days are mostly made out of glass or acrylic. They must be radiating all over the place. I have no idea how these things pass FCC certification. And of course, I really don't know enough about any of this stuff to say how big a problem that really is, but I do know it's some kind of problem, and it's curious that basically nobody cares about it. It's particularly odd, in fact, because computer enthusiasts have known about the issue forever, like since before Van Eck published his paper. See, some of you may recognize the name of the Homebrew Computer Club, an informal gathering of nerds that began meeting in the mid-70s to discuss the then-new concept of the microcomputer. And famously, the very first meeting of that club was ostensibly where Steve Wozniak first had the idea for the Apple I. But at their third meeting, a man named Steve Dampier demonstrated the exact same thing I just showed you. But he did it using the first commercially available microcomputer, the Altair 8800. Now, he played a different song at first, one by the Beatles, so if I replicated that experiment, I'd get an orbital strike by Content ID, but his second choice was much safer. That was the 19th century novelty piece Daisy Bell, well known as the song HAL 9000 sings as he's being dismantled in 2001, but it actually has quite the legacy in computing history. Both the 2001 scene and Dampier's demo were actually references to an event in 1960 when researchers at Bell Labs used an IBM 7094 mainframe connected to a primitive speech synthesizer to not just play the melody, but also sing the lyrics. Now, Dampier couldn't have done that on a 2 megahertz computer with a couple kilobytes of RAM, but I think his much simpler demo still said enough to his audience, especially considering he discovered the technique by accident. Apparently, he had a weather radio sitting on top of his Altair while he was programming it, and when he ran a program, he heard interference in the signal. That gave him the idea to exploit that interference to play music. So, in other words, he first saw this phenomenon as undesirable behavior. He then told that to everyone, and then nobody really did anything about it. The very people who kicked off the microcomputer revolution were aware of the problem on day zero, and yet the machines they went on to build had no protections against it. The Apple II's original case was made entirely of plastic, as were most other home computers, and they only changed that when the FCC forced them to. Now, obviously, this is partly because nobody building these machines thought anyone would ever put in the effort to spy on them, but computers have gotten a bit more important over the next 50 years, yet we're still doing the bare legally required minimum to protect them. I suppose the proof is in the pudding, though. If this were something we really needed to worry about, wouldn't someone have taught us a pretty harsh lesson by now? Well, hopefully that lesson isn't in the post. If it is, though, I'm not the guy to warn you about it. We're way past my level of expertise, so I think we should just wrap up at this point. If you stuck around for the whole video, thank you. I really appreciate it because it took me 3 months to put this together. There's almost no information out there about these things for obvious reasons, so I had a number of false starts as I tried to figure out how to document the basically undocumented, while simultaneously being attacked by the realities of life. I'm doing fine, but 2026 has been a heck of a year for me so far. It was real hard to stay focused, especially on such a vague topic. As I hope you realize, something like 95% of this video is speculation. I cited every actual document I could find that talked about the machine, and that amounted to 3 specimens. The rest is informed guesswork, and while that may sound like easy mode, not being constrained by facts and all, you'd be surprised how hard it is to do that in good faith. I did my level best not to say anything that didn't seem like it was at least true about something, even if not this thing, and hopefully I got it mostly right. If not, well, I rest assured that very few people watching this are going to go off and make big life decisions based on my misinformation. It doesn't seem likely. So, assuming you took this as the entertainment it was meant as, I hope you were entertained. If you were, consider subscribing to my channel. I try to do things at least this interesting as often as I can, though I admit after this project, I'm going to try for some smaller ones for a while. Remember, turn on notifications if you want to find out when I release those, but if you really enjoyed this, then consider supporting me on Patreon like these folks are doing. This is my full-time job, and without them, I couldn't have put in the time and effort to research, write, and rewrite this script. So I'm incredibly grateful to all my patrons for making this possible. Thank you all so much, and everyone else, thanks for watching.